here we are. What's good, everybody? My name is Alckemy. Welcome to the channel. If you've seen my comprehensive guide to Neurobass part 1 and 2, then you know that I'm constantly trying to push the ideas of sound design and the envelope further for how cool we can make our basses and just kind of what we can do. And over time, as you're continuing to grow, I'm also trying to continue to grow as well. And I've got a lot to share with you today that is hopefully going to kind of give you some insight on just how to make better basses and make them more dramatic and intricate and stuff. I've kind of gone down this interesting route of randomization, if that makes sense. And I find that the reason why I kind of lean towards that as opposed to going for exactly what I want is kind of going to be what the theme of today is all about, which is versatility. The patches that I've been designing lately, if you haven't been on my streams or noticed things in general, is having the ability to use one patch to make a wide variety of sounds just at the tip of your finger. And the reason why I like doing this is because, for one, it's taught me how to find the relationship between a lot of how effects work together, and two, it gives me inspiration to keep coming back to the same patches or same kind of patches or whatever without having the need to design more. Now, it's not to say that you shouldn't make deliberate sounds or that you shouldn't take the time to figure out how to get exactly what you want, but I find that for me in particular, I have a lot more fun in the sense of discovery as opposed to trying to get something exactly how it is. I think that it's very important to say these kind of things before we get into this kind of video, or actually it's most likely going to be a series, which we'll talk about in a second. But if you have the right mindset coming into sound design, then it's a lot easier for you to appreciate what you make as opposed to, trying to recreate a patch from a really cool song that you heard. It's not to say that you shouldn't try, and it's not to say that you shouldn't, continue to strive towards recreating those sounds if that's what you're really into. But it's important to make sure that you are a sound designer or that you're a musician that sounds like you. And for the most part, up until recent, I don't really do a whole lot of videos of how to sound like this person, how to sound like this person. We will explore that later in the channel at some point, but more importantly, it's about how to develop yourself within your own sound design. So taking this stuff into account with all this, you will start to find through hopefully this video series that I will be taking you through how to make a simple bass into how to figure out what makes a bass move. Then I'll show you the quote-unquote neuro aspects of it, and then I'll show you how to do the second part of it in the same patch, which is how to make a generator. If you don't know what Neurobass is, it's just a very processed bass, and there's a lot of different characteristics how people describe. It was kind of like coined, I guess, when neurohop kind of came about in general, or neurofunk. Neurofunk came first, but it doesn't really matter to me. It's just kind of that aesthetic in general. There's a few different kinds. The first one is kind of like the squelchy type neurobass that you would kind of think of like Tipper and Cursa. And then you have these really low roaring basses that kind of just sound like really dark monsters that are bigger than you talking. And those are the ones that I'm more interested in covering today as opposed to the other, because the other one typically is just a lot easier to do, and I'll show you the characteristics of that when the time comes. Today we're going to be looking at part 1. It's going to be about how to take a look at making a really thick bass, and then we're going to figure out how to do some simple movement without too much processing in order to do that. The second part we'll be looking at filtering, the third part we'll be looking at the neuro aspect, and then the fourth part we'll be looking at the generator stuff. So if you like this kind of information, then please do me a favor and make sure that you're subscribed to stay up to date, and let me know what you guys think in the comments for this kind of information, or if you have any other tricks that you would either like me to cover, or if you want to share with me and open up a discussion. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into Faceplant. Now this video is going to be relatively unedited for the most part, just because I want to make sure that you see how everything is done from beginning to end. And sometimes it's nice just to be able to not have to worry so much about editing and just kind of do this from, I guess, scratch, right? Faceplant is really awesome for this, and you can do this in just about any synth. The main thing that I want to keep in mind with this is that you don't need a particular synth, you don't need a particular program, you just need to understand what goes into what and what makes what work. However, because Faceplant is so streamlined, and because it is such an easy tool to kind of show you everything that I would like to do within this, it's very easy for me to kind of keep you on track for how to demonstrate the kind of things that I'm going to show you today. So let's go ahead and start with just something super simple. Most of the time, neurobasses kind of stem from something called a Reese bass, and that was from this dude who made the bass, and kind of they named it after him, and he should have copyrighted it because he'd probably be super rich if he's not already. But what really goes into the characteristics of that is just understanding that you've got two oscillators or two voices or more that are detuned against each other. And the reason why this is so popular is because it creates a very pleasing sound called phase cancellation. So if you go into two different voices and you listen to the detuning of this, you're going to notice that we're already introducing a specific kind of movement that the higher you play a pitch, the faster it's going to quote unquote sound like it's oscillating. So take a listen to this. And so this is actually one of my favorite things to use, and probably 9 times out of 10 I actually start with something that's kind of like a saw. And I typically play this at a lower octave, but I usually turn the detuning up. But the more that you kind of get into that movement, the more that it's going to make it sound like it's actually kind of like, I don't know, it just sounds more powerful to me. There's a lot of different synthesizers that can do this, almost every single one, if not. And one thing that you can kind of make sure in order to make this a little bit thicker is to add something called distortion. Hopefully you know what distortion is, otherwise we need to have a separate conversation. And then also going into doing a little bit of notch filtering. Now the reason why we do this is because if you kind of focus on taking out some of the low mids kind of in this region, I'd say 250 to 700 hertz, then what you end up getting yourself into is having this little gap. And I can't really describe why, but having this little gap right here kind of helps this out. Take a listen. Pretty big difference, right? So one cool thing that you can kind of focus on is kind of just adjusting this in general, because just moving the cutoff of this ever so slightly is going to start to change the timbre of the sound. Hopefully you can tell the difference between all of that, and it's not the most dramatic thing, but you can kind of see that by staying in this region here, you end up getting a lot of cool, I guess I would say, like vocal tonalities. Keep that in your pocket for now, because we're going to be talking about that in just a second whenever we talk about more filtering things and whatnot. So this bass is already sounding pretty decent, but what we're going ahead and do is pump the low end up a little bit, kind of like this, and then also bring up the high end just a little bit. It's kind of interesting because this is almost like doing what this is doing, but in the opposite way. So instead of cutting this away, we're actually pushing the low and the high up. Take a listen. Now, you can achieve something like this in a lot of different ways. You can use multi-band dynamics. You can, like with upwards compression or something, you can add more distortion. You can just turn the volume up. You can pull the mids down without turning everything else up in general, but this is just a particular practice that I do. And you kind of want to keep in mind from now, and again, I'm trying not to get too ahead of myself, but you want to think about how an EQ being pushed into distortion is going to react with each other. So again, that's kind of foreshadowing into when we get to the filtering part, but just kind of keep that in mind. So the next thing that we're going to do is actually, I'm going to show you a particular trick that I've noticed or that I found through Faceplant. And I can't really describe what's happening. It's a really cool phenomenon though, but what we'll do is we'll take a saturator, and you kind of want to pull back on everything in this way, because this is just going to make it sound kind of broken, or you might like it, but it sounds like this. You can add more distortion if you want more fuzz, by all means. But I'm typically looking for a little bit more of a cleaner sound. So what we're going to do from here is add a stereo and make sure that this signal is in mono. And then from here, we're going to add an LFO. And we're going to set this to kind of like a somewhat slow rate, maybe here. If you go in and you do panning to this with the distortion and you force this into mono, then you actually introduce some kind of thing that makes it sound like a flanger. And it's really cool. Here's what it sounds like. Now Now that might be a little bit extreme, but I kind of wanted to make sure that you knew what this was. So even if you set this to a really small amount, you can kind of see how you can control that in this way. And the reason why I like this effect is because it's very reminiscent of if you were to bounce out a saw wave and slightly detune it in such a way. Now this doesn't move with the pitch, and you can set it to if you want it to. One cool trick that you will notice me do in some of my patches, if you haven't seen it before, is that you can actually set the center of this to something like F0, maybe F1 rather, turn the range down to 12, and then pull this down here. And now whenever this moves in pitch, it's actually going to move the flanging with it. Now that's a little bit overkill, but just to kind of demonstrate how far you can go with that, it's a pretty powerful tool. That actually sounds a lot better. So in general, you can kind of keep this into a specific place if you want, but one thing that I like to do in particular is once I kind of have something like this set up, I like to either go into adding stereo by doing one or two things or both. For one, we can think about adding another group here, and this is something that I also don't see very often, but adding another kind of high-end oscillator in this sense that is going to be an octave up. We can set this to detuning as well, but we can introduce some spread. Or we can try to introduce some effects that are going to introduce like pseudo stereo in particular. Hello, I am so sorry for interrupting this video, and I hope that you're enjoying the content. If you aren't already, I would really appreciate if you took the time to subscribe and turn the notifications on. As you can see on my analytics, only about 10% of my subscriber base are actually kind of being notified about my videos. Hit the subscribe button, turn the notifications on, help a brother out, enjoy the rest of the video. So let's do a little bit of both for now. I like this, however, it's a little bit too prominent within the mix, right? Because that kind of makes it sound like it's a little bit something else and we lose that interesting movement. So something that I like to do instead is go ahead and grab something called a randomizer here, set this to smooth, maybe something kind of slow in this way, and then introduce a little bit of level, maybe up to 50%, which is actually equal to 100% because this goes all the way up to 200%. So take a listen to this. And so thinking about this just off of the bat, it's kind of interesting because it doesn't always have that high end, but when it does, you get these subtle instances of stereo, and that can kind of be advantageous because it makes it just more diverse in that way. One other thing that you can consider is that this doesn't have to be an octave. You can set this to have multiple voices. For example, we can duplicate this with a different randomizer perhaps. Turn this up. And then this can be, say, 19 voices, or maybe we don't want this to be quite as loud. But this one will be super detuned, almost like a Hoover, and we can kind of use that to kind of introduce even more movement. Which is kind of nice. So all the other things still apply to this as well, and you don't have to do it, but you can because it's an option, and that's part of the reason why I like faceplant so much. But we can kind of use this to get creative in some other ways as well, in case if this does become too kind of prominent in other ways. For one, adding distortion to make this a little bit chunkier is not a bad idea by any means. Now, one thing that I did forget to mention was that both of these are still going out to the same output, so even though this does sound a little bit kind of thicker in that way, it's not quite as wide. So one thing that you can do to kind of fix that is to send it to lane 2 instead. And there's your stereo if you want that. However, I think that by doing the combination between the two and then adding stereo later, we've got some more high-end content, so we can actually abuse this a little bit more whenever we get to that part. So going on, now what I want to do is introduce some other kind of basic filtering, and it's not going to be anything too complicated, but what I'm actually going to do is grab a bandpass. And if we take a listen here, then you can see that you get some interesting movement in that way. And so we can add another randomizer here to kind of introduce that and just kind of let that play on its own. Pretty interesting stuff, huh? Now, one thing that I am going to do before we go on any further is I'm actually going to add a limiter to this. We're going to make that just a little bit louder. And whenever we combine kind of all these things here in general, it can sound really nice whenever we get into doing the pitch kind of like stuff. And that sounds pretty good to me. One other thing that I might want to consider though is actually even doing a little bit more detuning to this. Typically I go pretty far with that, actually, up to here. Now, one thing that you're going to want to keep in mind is that whatever synthesizer you're using, the detuning engine or the unison engine rather, is going to behave differently. So don't think that two voices is going to work in the same way as you would do this in something like Serum. And it's just because of the algorithm of which like these things are built, right? I find that like in Serum or so, I usually like 4 voices, and Vital, I usually end up using 3 voices. It doesn't really matter. Just play around with it until you find something that you like, and don't worry about recreating this timbre exactly. That's really important. Don't worry about recreating this timbre exactly. It's not that important. So now that we have a little bit more detuning, we've got something like this. And now that we've got a little bit of movement here, let's go ahead and bring this a little bit more alive by adding another instance of movement to both the cutoff here. I'm going to pull this down a little bit, turn the slope to 6, and then also pull down the resonance here. And now this is going to make this kind of do some interesting talking and stuff because of the notch opening and closing while also sweeping the frequency range. Cool. Now we introduced a cool trick earlier with the note. So one thing that you can do, as long as you're aware of it, and you don't have to do it, but one thing that's, sometimes cool to do is to actually add the same note stuff to the randomization here. So we can pull that down and do that on all fronts. So that way, whenever we do pitching, it's actually going to make this move faster to kind of mirror or to match the movement that we get whenever we get that super fast detuning at the higher pitch. Now that's a little bit too fast for me, so I'm going to go ahead and pull this up a bit. Same thing for here. Same thing for here. Nice. Now, the next thing that we're going to get into is a little bit of multipass, and I'm not going to talk about super filtering and stuff from here, but we're just going to introduce just a little bit of stereo, and this is going to kind of pre-frame getting into the next part, which we'll talk about like filtering and stuff. But some easy things that you can think about is getting into what's called frequency splitting, and really that's kind of self-explanatory in that sense, but what you do is you divide the output into anywhere from 2 to I guess 5 bands here, just from multipass in general. You can do however many you want, but usually I only do 2 or 3. And so you have the ability to control certain aspects of the frequency range that you can make effects applied. Now, one thing that you want to keep in mind is that like I would definitely encourage you to experiment, but a lot of times when people talk about doing frequency splitting and like going crazy with effects, it's good to go the extreme route and figure out what everything does, but a lot of times you don't need that many effects in order to make something like quote unquote interesting. So I'm going to kind of focus on these 2 regions for now. The first thing that I'm going to do is make sure that the low end is in mono, and that's going to kind of help protect us and make sure that we still have a solid fundamental. So if I were to solo this, there's movement within this bass, but I don't have any phase cancellation. And you can go anywhere from say 80 to 200 hertz. It really just depends on what it is that you're looking for, but I kind of like to be a little bit risque and make this pretty low in this region. The middle is kind of where all the movement happens, and again, we'll talk about this when we get to the filtering aspect of things, but if we take a listen to this, there's a lot that we can do with this in general. If we take a listen to this, that's just kind of the sizzle on top, and so if anything, we can think about either spreading that out really wide or adding more distortion depending on how much crunch we want with this. But again, this is where we're going to notice most of the differences that we kind of throw into it, just because our ears are tuned to this frequency range in general. 3K is the sweet spot, which I guess would be here. That's because that's usually where babies cry. But again, that's, you know, this is what you feel, this is what you notice, or this is what you hear, and then this is kind of the energy. That's just a really easy rule of thumb in general. So as far as getting into some stereo processing, you don't really have to go crazy with it, but if you just give yourself a little bit of something like chorus, turn the spread down, turn the mix down, that kind of helps you have a little bit of a thicker sound. And then you can get into some other experimental things as well that we'll talk about whenever we get to the neuro processing side of things, like pitch shifting, short delays, and all that other stuff. But to keep things kind of simple, something that you might want to practice is just doing an easy little ensemble right here, turning the mix down by quite a bit, and then pulling the spread down to give it just a little bit of kind of motion on top. This is cool because it says 6 voices, but if you actually click on this, you can go up to 16. You usually don't need that much, but you can experiment if you want. So that sounds pretty cool. It's nothing, you know, too crazy, hopefully so far, for the length of this video. But what we can do is kind of go into something like this and this. Set this to random on 4 out of 16 and just kind of mess with the mix a bit and kind of let these do their own thing. Now I know that this video has kind of been a lot to cover, but we haven't really done that much stuff compared to what I usually do in that sense. And so just by adding a few effects here, I mean 1 effect per band, and just by adding a little bit of extra stuff over in this region, we've already got a lot to work with. Now in particular, I probably would actually back off of doing the chord aspect of things. I kind of just wanted to show you that as a possibility, but let's take a listen and see how this sounds with just the octave. Not too bad. I think that we can actually push this a little bit further as well. And because we can take advantage of some of the unison movements between this, we can actually change this into synthetic. And I really like how this sounds. It's almost kind of like what I was talking about towards the kind of middle point of the video where it sounds like it's tearing on its own. I'm going to turn the slope up on this too and really focus in on this low middle region here. Awesome. Let's go ahead and finish up to make this something that's somewhat usable on its own. So what I'm going to get into now is a couple more things. I'm going to introduce a reverb over the entire signal. And instead of leaving it on, I'm actually going to change this to opening and closing kind of like that. And this is going to kind of go from being a dry signal to super wet and big. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a filter. I'm actually going to do that here. And I'm going to give this an independent randomizer. Say 1/4. And I'm going to change the cutoff here kind of in this way. And maybe leave it more towards the high end. Now, the effect chain is actually kind of important once you get to this stage, because if you put the reverb under the filter, then it's going to be closed most of the time. But if you leave the reverb after this, it's actually going to sound a lot more interesting. The thing that is also going to matter a lot is the speed of things. I'm going to turn the notes up to 24 and hopefully reduce this by just a bit. and maybe see if we can get back to making all this stuff a little bit quicker. And again, for me, like I'm kind of doing this on the fly. I didn't really have any particular sound in mind. I kind of just wanted to show you the general processing aspect of things that I do. You really want to kind of just use your ears and use your intuition that you will develop over time as a sound designer in general. Sounds pretty good. I'm going to give this just a little bit of movement downwards and see if we can make this move a little bit faster whenever we pitch that up as well. Not too bad. Let's go ahead and clean this up. So I'm going to do what I do on every single patch pretty much, which is add the kilohertz version of OTT, which is actually technically the dynamics, the overachiever aspect. I've kind of made my own version of that off of that preset, which is kind of the same exact thing. You just turn off the low band and you turn off the super high band, and then kind of turn the mix to 50%. That gives it a little bit more high-end presence. Then what we're going to do is we're going to come back into multipass here and do the same thing that we were talking about, which is making sure that the low end is in mono. And then finally, we're going to add in just a little bit of dynamics here to control the sound in general. One thing that you're going to run into whenever you do a lot of experimental sound design is you're going to have crazy dynamics from the reaction of filters and effects that are interacting with each other. Now, the thing to keep in mind with that is that the more kind of like loud and quiet parts that you have within a single sound, the more compression that you want to add, because you don't want to have something that seems really quiet and then you're like, oh, it's so quiet, and you turn it up hella loud and then it blows your ears out, or, you know, blows your speakers. So that's typically why a lot of music that's like heavy and experimental in that region is so compressed in general. It's because in order to make it work, like you got to like level everything out. Otherwise it's going to be too freaking crazy and all over the place and like really uncontrollable in order to be usable. So once we kind of pull this down a little bit, which is kind of actually going to kind of mellow the volume out, then we can actually push the limiter a little bit harder in that way. Pretty cool. Now, from not really going too deep into filtering and going into some other neuroprocessing aspects, I think that this is a great starting place in order for you guys to be able to practice of just being able to build something that's actually usable by all means. If you don't like any aspect of the sound, or maybe in a sense like you like some parts but you didn't like the other parts, you can just take that out. Like let's say you didn't like, you know, the high-end octave on this. You can either change it to something different, maybe like 7 semitones, and make it something like a chord. Maybe you don't want this at all and you just keep this. Maybe you want to keep everything consistent with the randomization, but you don't want it to move with the pitch. You can turn that off too, which is totally fine as well. Or maybe you want to go into like making things a lot more deep within the source sound itself, or use something, you know, kind of different than that. You can always kind of turn all this stuff off, which is really convenient, without having to do too much work, and go in and add something else, like maybe a wavetable or so. Let's say, you know, you want to do something in this region and like you're like, man, I don't really know that this is like going to be different enough. So instead, I'm going to introduce a little bit of FM modulation to the phase here. You can also do AM modulation over here, thanks Data Broth. And if you want to kind of switch up the sound in that way, then you can add FM and make it more interesting. I actually think that sounds pretty cool. So let's go ahead and duplicate this. And then what we can do is add the wavetable positioning here. And I know that we're just using a simple wavetable, but this is kind of cool because it will kind of sweep across in that way and kind of continue to help evolve the sound without doing like crazy filtering or so. Crazy, right? So what we can also do is we can take a same randomizer or so, and we can go and add this little star right here. And so what this is it allows us to modulate a modulator. So this is dictating how much of the phase is going, and then that will kind of also move with the wavetable. Then all you have to do is kind of turn everything else back on. And you can kind of see like how much, like how far you can get into with this, right? And this isn't even exploring all the options. I mean, there really is just too many options to cover. You can change the wavetable if you want. If you're working in an analog type thing, then you can start to add synth to this. So which is actually kind of cool. So maybe you wanted to do another one here, and let's just pull this down to a faster randomizer in this way. You can add in this sync. And you guys see why I'm starting to choose randomizers and stuff now, right? That's because, for one, I don't have to like control all of these individual things at once, because that would be a nightmare in automation. But two, I can get to see how they interact with each other just by pushing F. And that to me is a lot more fun and a lot more exciting to kind of see what happens whenever you're exploring sound design in general, right? So take a listen to this. Cool. Now let's say maybe this is really interesting and stuff, but we want it to kind of open and close a lot more, which is kind of like the theme of what was going on. Well, all we have to do really is just kind of go back to this last filter here and just pull this all the way up and this way. And then let me see, this is random here. I'm going to go and find out whatever that's controlling. Okay, here we go. In that sense, let's make this just a little bit faster and turn the jitter up. And this will make this open and close a lot more. Yeah, so it gets pretty cool and exciting from there. So I think that without, again, going too far into detail and stuff, we notice that there's a lot of different ways, especially within Phase Plant, that you can introduce a lot of movement and a lot of interest just by taking advantage of the oscillator controls and then doing, I guess, like some light filtering and stuff. We're only using 2 filters here. I guess 3. Yeah, we're only using 2 for now because we turned the other thing off. We have a notch filter and a low pass, and that's not frequency dependent. It's just on the entire sound. And that's an easy way to get just kind of the ball rolling. So don't think that you have to do like crazy filtering and stuff, even though we'll go into that later. But you can kind of see that having the right combination of things with the right mindset can give you some interesting results in that way. This stuff over here is just like how to make it actually work. But this stuff over here and then this stuff is kind of like what gives it the characteristic and the timbre of what it is that we're looking for, right? And if, by all means, like I said before, if you don't like any of this stuff, then you can always just turn it off. I think that I like the stereo aspect of that, but depending on how you like to mix your tune, assuming that you know a thing or two about mixing, you can keep everything in mono if you want, or you can push the multipass stereo quote unquote aspect of this and then make it mono again, and you'll get something else that's interesting sometimes. I mean, heck, you can even do that and put the stereo at the end of the chain. But because you have the ability to kind of have so much freedom within all this stuff, because like Faceplant in general is semi-modular, and you can do the same thing on external effects outside of here as well, which we'll talk about later. But you have the ability to do those kinds of things, then it's just a matter of mixing and matching and figuring out what you like, as opposed to, am I making the right choice? So to kind of recap, we started with a very simple waveform. We added a notch filter right in between after detuning it to kind of give it that more prominent movement with some basic distortion. Then we pushed it through an EQ. We added that cool little distortion trick where you kind of move this and set this to mono in that way. Once we kind of had a nice little timbral sound, we went into multipass and gave it some stereo. And then we kind of finished up the quote-unquote timbre of the sound with the filter and reverb. Somewhere in between that, we also kind of explored the idea of having maybe a secondary voice on here with either a chord or, you know, a seventh with a bandpass. And this doesn't have to be a bandpass. It could be anything, but you can layer multiple like kind of quote-unquote oscillator groups and also do like different like means of splitting. And then finally, to make things more interesting, we introduced some sync and then also some FM modulation from a wavetable on the outside. We added an OTT. We made sure that the low end was in mono here, and then gave it some compression in order to control the sound, then finally pushed the limiter up to 0 dB. So in that sense, hopefully this was a very in-depth kind of, how do you say, explanation of how to get yourself up and running in something like Faceplant, or heck, you can even do most of this stuff in Serum or like with external processing with a DAW or something. But the key to getting good filtering out of Neurobass is really understanding a couple of things. For one of the most important things that you will get is like what filter goes where, and of course like that's subjective, but you know, like specifically talking about like where would you place a bandpass to get what kind of specific sound, or a notch filter, what makes something sound like it's talking versus what makes something sound like it's squelchy. How does it develop a relationship when you use an EQ or when you push distortion and have a relationship with filtering? And then also we can talk about things like multiband. So as you can tell, there's a lot of different things for me to look at, but before we get into that, I'm going to provide a quick demonstration to you to understand like how easy it is to actually start getting the tonalities of a Neurobass. Right now, I've got something that's just as simple as a sine wave. And all I'm going to do is grab a distortion unit just like this. And then I'm going to grab a filter and we're going to duplicate this. And then we're going to duplicate this. So we've got distortion, filter, filter, and then maybe one more distortion. So one of the key principles that we can talk about is something that I think that Frequent gave to the world, which is called sine compression. He's pretty much the first person that I've ever heard say something like that, and I don't know particularly where he got it from or if he made it up, but it doesn't matter. What we have now is a couple of notches here with a large slope, and we're going to automate with a randomizer where these two kind of move off and on. So take a listen to this. Let's grab a randomizer like this. This one is going to go here. We'll set this to a fast rate, kind of like that, and then we will duplicate this. So what we're going to do is this one is going to go up. This one is going to go down by quite a bit. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take the same modulators and do the opposite of what the one on top is doing. So they're going to kind of be pit against each other. So let's listen to how this sounds. So you can tell that by just having a couple of like key tools and knowing how to do something like that, you're already starting to get these characteristics. And then all of the effects that kind of, how do you say, come afterward, all the subsequent effects can really just be like shaping specific characteristics that you want to use. So one thing that I'll do over here is I'm going to add a limiter. But from this point on, like there's a lot of different things that we can use to manipulate or change the idea of what it is that we're trying to do. A lot of times we start with something like a respace, right? But depending on what tonality you're going for, if you know how to use filtering, then you can pretty much like pull that particular characteristic out of almost any sound, provided you've got harmonics. The theory behind how all this stuff works is that if you've got a really thick sound that is harmonically rich, regardless of if you're adding harmonics through FM or through distortion or a combination of both, or stacking sounds before you filter it, you're going to give the filter more to cut. That's the like fundamental principle. What comes after that is understanding what filter frequencies or like what frequencies sound like whenever a filter is interacting with it, regardless of what kind of band it is. And by band, I mean like what different filter types. So as a quick example, if I play something that is kind of in the low mid region right here, then we can isolate these frequencies and kind of listen to how that sounds on its own. So take a listen here. Let me move this back by a significant amount. I'm also going to deactivate the resonance here. Okay, so if this were a robot, what would he be saying? Whoa, right? So we can kind of already tell that by pushing or by focusing on the low mid frequencies, that is giving us some kind of low vocal tonality. Likewise, the further that we go up along the frequency range, the more, I guess, kind of high pitch, or you can even say that in some cases, the more squelchy it's going to become. So let's go ahead and sweep up. I'm going to give this a higher harmonic, or sorry, a higher pitch, so that way we can tell what this is doing. Even if we want to maybe stack this with an octave, so that way we've got something else to cut through. And one thing that it brings up a good point naturally here is that in order for a filter to sound like it's working, it has to have frequencies to cut through. So let's give it some. So you can see that by sweeping these frequencies here in the higher region, you're naturally getting that kind of squelchy, nasally sound. And it doesn't really matter what frequency band you use. That's something that kind of just applies because that's just the way that our ears are tuned. And once we understand that, then when you're talking about making kind of low growling sounds or low roaring sounds or whatever, you kind of already have a place to start regardless of what your source is. So for me in particular, we've already kind of started developing the ideas of like what would go into a Neurobass in the first place. So if I turn this on and we go and do some basic, I guess, processing to this, maybe let's say we want to turn this into a Reese of some sort. Maybe we want to add just a little bit of noise at the end, or maybe even right here. So we can hit Command and go into something like noise, and you only need just a little bit because of how much distortion we have here. But you can already see that we're starting to get there. There isn't really like, you don't have to go much further than this. However, what I would kind of particularly theorize or categorize things of where to go next would obviously to be to make the sound shine. So that's where we would get into our stereo processing and so forth. But that's for next video. So now that this demonstration is kind of complete and you see how easy it is to kind of develop something that's pretty easy, my advice to you would be to really just spend some time, grab yourself a nice chunky audio form, grab these filter types and see what these basic ones do, because there's only so many different filter types, right? And what happens is like whenever you have a complex filter, which we'll make here in a second, it really just becomes a combination of pretty much these to some degree. You've got some slopes, you've got some peaks, you've got some dips. It might be a variation of having a bunch of bell curves. That might be a lot of them to do like a comb filter or something. But at its base, you can use single filters and move them in serial or move them in parallel or whatever to start to create your own filters in that way. It's just understanding how the signal flow goes. So that'll get us into the next thing. I'll talk about probably frequency splitting at the end, but let's take a look at slice EQ. And by the way, I am using kilohertz faceplant, but that's because this is, it just, oh man, it's so good. I talked about this yesterday in the last video. So let's say I wanted to get into complex filtering, right? Well, what are some combinations that we can do? The most common one from like 2012 all the way to 2016 was 2 notches and a boost. So we've got something like this, and then maybe right here we've got something kind of like this. And what these are doing is kind of just sweeping along the frequency range. Now, thanks to Copycat, which is one of the most important things that he taught me, is that whenever you're doing complex filtering on a parametric EQ, it's working in serial. So on one end, the bands are interacting with each other whenever they move. However, it's still on a serial, like, I guess, routing chain. So keep that in mind whenever you do this. Now, within all this stuff, the way that we used to do this was we would use something like ProQ or maybe EQ8 or maybe parametric EQ2 if you're in FL Studio, and you would pretty much automate these over time. Now, I don't do that anymore. And the reason why is because it's too much work. So because of something beautiful like faceplant, Or if you have Bitwig or something that has a modulator on it, you can use either LFOs, multi-stage envelopes, or in this case, I'm going to use randomizers. We can just use these. What I can do is I can grab the cutoff of these here, and now these are interacting with each other. And then what I can do is I can grab the other one and move this to some place. It's where now all of these are interacting in some cool, unpredictable way. I'm not really concerned about what it's doing right now. And even if you are cutting this too much, or let's say like this is cutting out a lot of the low end right here, you can always move this over. You can always move this to some different place as well. Maybe I want this to focus on those low mids like I was talking about. And then maybe for this one here, I want it to do something different. But what we can also do is we can make another randomizer, and we can start to make this be really dramatic by pulling the resonance up and down in this way. So just by stacking these in such a way, we haven't done any frequency splitting or anything to any degree. We're already getting some interesting things by having these filter bands interact with each other. The cool thing about these and doing things in this way is the fact that like whenever we make sounds with our mouth, like it is essentially to some degree projecting a sound from our vocal cord and then using a combination of our lips and our teeth and our tongue to essentially filter things out. That's pretty mind-blowing, right? So for whatever case, like for me, I've been doing this a long time, and obviously like I kind of already am cheating because I know where to go and how to get stuff that works like this. But the key thing that you want to remember is that you can pretty much do any filter shape or multiple or different types of notes that you want to, and I encourage you to experiment. But it doesn't stop there. There's more that we can do. One idea that I want to pitch to you, which is one of the coolest features about Phase Plant, in my opinion, is the fact that with the slice EQ, we have a mix function. So let's pretend that like this is doing too much. Let's pretend like it's cutting too many of the sounds or whatever, and at some points we want it to actually have a little bit of the original character. Well, the reason why this is so cool is because we can use another randomizer or a macro or any other modulator to mess with the mix. So that means that at certain points, it's going to cut a lot of the sound out. And at certain points, it's going to allow the entire chunky waveform, minus this processing, of course, to kind of bleed through or to kind of play through the whole thing. So take a listen to that. Okay, sweet. So let's say that we wanted this to do even more. One quick thing that you can do to try to like just play with some ideas is to take another randomizer like this and add just a little bit of pitch drift to this at a slow rate, because what's going to happen is that that's going to make it sound like it's kind of like, for lack of better description, like in pain or something, right? So if you set this to a really slow rate and you turn up the jitter, take a listen to that. Sweet. So as you can tell, like we've already gotten a really interesting sound just by stacking distortion and filters on top of each other. And that's one thing that I think is really important to remember whenever you're doing this kinds of stuff, is that there's always a relationship between the effects that you stack on. And while it's important to explore and like you gotta obviously have to figure out this stuff for yourself and like do your own work of being like, okay, well, how does this work with this? When you keep that in mind, then essentially like you can start to build any kind of sound out of any sound. Right? Any characteristic of like electronic digital processing, I would say, because you can't necessarily just make something sound, you know, like somebody is singing or something. Like with enough processing, you can get close, but I guess I wanted to just make sure that the right mindset is out for that. But if you're trying to turn something into a bass or you're trying to turn something into a pad, that's more so what I mean, as opposed to, you know, you can make something that sounds like a taxi completely sound like something different. There's a lot more legwork that goes into that. Okay, sorry, just wanted to be clear on that. Within all this stuff, if I were to turn everything off, whenever you guys are doing these kinds of processes, again, it's really important to be mindful about what frequencies you're boosting and what frequencies you are, how do you say, either cutting or whatever. We talked about the vocal cord thing or whatever, but one other thing that you can do to kind of practice and understand these things is also do frequency stacks, because resonance also plays a key part in this stuff. I'm actually going to use the nonlinear filter for this because I think this is going to be a better example. So if we have a sine wave here and we've got a bandpass, this is what it sounds like on its own. I'm going to turn the saturation off. Cool. Now let's go ahead and turn the saturation up. This is a distortion unit, or a drive type, or drive mode rather, that is pushing this through. So I'm just going to leave it on saturated for now, just for the sake of time, but take a listen to this. And if you've watched my last video that I recently put up, you can kind of see that whenever these are stacked on top of each other via resonance like this, let's go ahead and duplicate that and maybe one more time, then you can start to get some interesting tonalities from the way that these resonances stack on top of themselves. See, and that's kind of getting into that really cool sound that I did a speedrun on earlier in the year. So what we can also do is maybe mix and match these different distortion types on top of themselves. And what I'm also going to do is just push the cutoff of maybe one a little bit more, kind of like this. And let's listen to how that sounds. Let's push some distortion through it. And then we can maybe try different modes on here. Okay, so like you kind of have to be careful with this, and it's always good to put a limiter at the end, but you can start to see that by stacking these in a particular way that you can actually end up getting some really interesting results sometimes. And it's not just that you push distortion into a filter, you can also do the opposite, where you have some kind of distortion after the filter in order to bring back some of the frequencies that you're obviously cutting, right? Which is usually a more common practice anyways. But if we use something like a saturator, noise. Then what we can do is maybe come back here, add our slice EQ, and then we can start to turn this other stuff on and just kind of see how it sounds. It might be cool, it might not be cool, I don't really know, but let's go ahead and find out. Cool. But you can kind of tell by mixing and matching some of these things that like there's a bunch of different combinations that you can do, and like each one has a signature sound. So I would encourage you to not only mess with the bandpass, but see what happens when you stack a notch on top of this with the bandpass with something else of the sort. And that's going to ultimately lead you towards having a better understanding of filtering as a whole. So now let's go ahead and talk about something that is probably the most like, I guess like you can't really like talk about Neurobass without frequency splitting, right? And lucky for us, we have multipass here, which pretty much does all the work for us. So in regards to filtering here, it's important to kind of like think or to rationalize what we're going to do or what kind of filtering we're going to do on these bands. And this is going to sound stupidly obvious, but sometimes like I didn't, until I had multipass, it didn't really make as much sense to me. I would just do like different band splitting or frequency dependent splitting and just do whatever, but just bear with me for a second. Okay, so the low band is going from 0 to 245, then we've got the mid band from 245 to 3K, and then we have this at above 3K. So obviously it wouldn't make sense to have a low pass filter on here because it's not going to cut any frequencies. There's not anything that this is going to have to work with. It wouldn't start to do anything even if we have a chunky waveform. Like I know that there's some crossover or whatever, but that's a different story for a different day. But until we get to anything that's 245 and below, the filter isn't going to react in any way. So what we would do is instead is focus on what this can cut through or what would make sense for this. So if we're focusing on this, then what we can do is boost this up. And suddenly we have something that the filter can work with now. So whenever you guys are doing these kinds of things, then you might want to think about like how your, I guess, filters are going to cut through the specific frequencies if you're doing band splitting in this way. So for the mid band, you kind of have a lot to play with. There's a lot that you can do. And the other cool thing to think about too is kind of like what I talked about from before, is that all of these have a mix. And so you can kind of interpolate between having something like do a super filter and then messing with the mix or whatever, but possibilities are limitless. So it's really common for us to have something either like a notch or have something like a bandpass and focus on these low, mid to mid frequencies. For now, I'm going to focus on a notch because I don't want to cut out too much of the sound. If you were going to use a bandpass, then like the bandpass is like pretty much the most extreme filter that we have. And for some reason, it really cuts out a whole lot of the sound. So you'll have to do a lot of work to bring it back. Whereas a notch, in some case or another, has a lot more flexibility in how wide it can go and how much it can cut, if that makes sense. Because instead of it just focusing on what's in the middle, it focuses on what's on the sides. And another point that we can talk about too is that let's say you've only got 2 bands to work with, right? Well, what you can essentially do is actually create a custom notch filter here, which is very commonly done, kind of like this, where you are notching out the low end of some degree, and then you are cutting and doing a different style of thing over here, and messing with the high band. So what we're actually doing is actually we're messing with, this would actually be categorized as a band pass, but you can flip-flop it and you can have them interact with each other in such a way that can sometimes lead to some really cool, interesting results. So like by understanding like what you're cutting across, if you're thinking from low to high, the frequencies that you're doing really just depend on that. And the only difference between what we're doing here and the slice EQ is that these have independent signal chains that you can do on your own, as opposed to putting everything on serial and having it go all together, if that makes sense. So with that in mind, we can kind of continue in that way, where we would do something like a notch or a band pass, and then on the high end, we would have some kind of low pass filter, right? So in conjunction, all of these are interacting with the optimal frequency range in order to create that variation that we're talking about, in order to create that interest or to get the most dramatic impact that we would be looking for. So this one is cutting that one's doing its own thing. Unfortunately, with multipass, we only have 2 modulators. We can do more by setting the cutoff to a macro, and we can set a macro to the cutoff here and then use a modulator to mess with the macro. But for now, I'm going to kind of make that, just keep it a little bit more simple and just maybe do the opposite of what this one is doing. So that way they're just kind of all moving together. But this is what this would sound like. So with all these things in mind, like if you essentially treat these frequencies as a frequency spectrum from low to high, and then like because these are in parallel, you can do your individual processing. This would be the most important one, but you can kind of pretty much do whatever you want in order to kind of like quote unquote like shape and characterize your sound. And you can even have like a master filter over on the end if you want to dictate everything, right? So maybe this movement is really cool, but you want it to kind of open and close more. And filtering like can also be used as an additive means as well. And kind of like what we talked about before, like with the band pass being focused on like the low mid frequencies or whatever, you can take this and use a bell curve. And let's say you're cutting something on those low mids, and you can do this on any part of the chain. It doesn't really matter. But what we can do is take that same one, which is right here, and focus on trying to boost that up. That's moving downwards. So now these two are moving together in sync, right? That sounds really fat, but that's intended. So you can even do a boosting means. And the cool thing about this is like if you were to do something kind of like a nonlinear filter as well, then we can go back into the same ideas that we were talking about from before. Although it's kind of important to note that this actually doesn't have a bell curve, so like you would be cutting something and there's a trade-off in that sense. In between that, if you focus on, maybe setting something here to a modulator or whatever, like let's say again, like I did want to do this where I have the cutoff set to a macro here. So we'll just place this at a specific degree so that way it doesn't go all the way up or down. We can come out here and now we can use this as a modulator. And now this is going to move from the outside in between something right here. And you can see that like the routing options and the possibilities with this have so much potential in order for us to get some kind of interesting sounds out of this. But wait, What happens if you want to do this on a micro level? The cool thing, or the crazy thing rather, is that as opposed to having a single filter on here, for one, we can stack filters downward or vertically this way, but we can also use a slice EQ to create more complex filters in its own right. We can do something kind of like this and create, some kind of vowel of some sort, and instead of maybe going and doing all of the individual things, we can kind of cheat and just use the offset here to manipulate that in a different way. So I'll take LFO2 because it's only got one, and then we can kind of shape this towards the low mid region here, or try to find a nice little middle ground. But like I said before, you really want to be careful with this kind of stuff because you don't usually want this to go up and down the frequency range completely. You kind of just want to focus on like a key range of this in order to get something interesting, or to get something that's like, how do I say, something that's more usable or something that's more enjoyable for that sense. But play Goldilocks. This is too far. This isn't enough. You got to find just right. Does that all make sense? I hope so. I'm talking to myself. So there's that. Now, the other things that I want to talk about, because we've covered complex filtering, we've covered basic filtering, is the fact that a flanger and a phaser in some way or another are actually also filters, as well as a comb filter, which I gave it away. Comb filter, phaser, flanger are super similar in the sense that they are amalgamations of a comb filter in one way or another. So whenever we're talking about filtering and stuff, right, we're just talking about boosting / cutting frequencies, mostly cutting frequencies, right? You're filtering something through. It's like when you've got dirty water and then you're like, I want a clean glass of water, and you filter it through, and then you've got the pure, right? That's what we're doing, is we're making pureness. We're taking something that's super dirty and then making the sound pure. Okay, that's a bad analogy, but it works. Unfortunately, the comb filter in its own right doesn't really show what it's doing, but just think of it actually looking like a comb to where it has a bunch of peaks and a bunch of dips. So I guess I'll just make one super quickly. This filtering would get into something that's more considered, can also be considered getting into physical modeling if you have the correct frequency range here. But essentially a comb filter looks something like this. And a phaser flanger comb is just some variation of this in particular. So if I were to place this on the master, let me turn these other things off. It's kind of hard to detect, I know, so I'm going to push these up a little bit more, but I think it's important to kind of be able to distinguish what kind of sounds this stuff makes. And you can always create more bands too if you need to, but having these super crazy peaks like this and then kind of messing with it. Okay, hopefully that was a little bit more obvious, but those are the kinds of things that you want to be considerate of. Now that we understand that, if we kind of listen to what some of these other things can do, which is the phaser, flanger, and comb filter, then you can start to see how these can give you some specific characteristics as well. So if I just focus on this band and we play a sound, that kind of sounds like something that we've already maybe heard before, right? Which could be a flanger. So let's take a listen to trying to get a similar sound out of that. See the similarities? So of course it's not quite the same, and I would say that like these are again just specific presets of this, but these in essence are still kind of like would be considered in the same category. Just for the sake of understanding, we've also got our phaser. Unfortunately, this again doesn't have a visual, but that's okay. Take a listen. Hopefully you can hear kind of like the wobbling sound that's kind of within this. But I kind of did something subconsciously where I added these effects toward the middle. And I don't remember who said it. I think it was Frequent, but he or somebody anyways said that the magic is in the middle. So whenever you're applying these, I think that the best place to put them usually is in the middle. Now, on the low end, we usually want a clean low end, right? So it makes sense not to do a whole lot of stereo crazy processing to this, although if you just want to go for something interesting, then by all means do it. If you want something that has a lot of phasiness and stuff, that has a lot of noticeable movement, then you would put that on the middle band. And then if you want to really spread everything out, or you really just want to go crazy and all that stuff, then you can also do that to the high end as well. This would be, cool to maybe play something like an ensemble on here, which I'll talk more about when we get into part 3. But just know that these can all still be used as filtering and still would be categorized as filtering to some degree. So now that we have everything, this is pretty much like all there is to it. This is pretty much all you have to do to get into making the most complex filters or whatever as you can, because it's really just a bunch of simple things that you continue to stack together in such a way. If you don't have phase plan and you have something like Ableton, you can still do this by working horizontally, right? You can still do frequency splitting. You can still kind of like make different chain stacks and all that stuff. However, it's really just a matter of how you approach it, which would kind of lead us into the final thing that I'll talk about, which is just the idea of regular signal splitting. So if I use snap heap, I don't even have to do that. I can kind of send this to parallel lanes as well. But if I focus on snap heap and I turn all of these into parallel, then we have the entire frequency signal being split between these. And so what you can do with that instead is, let's say you've got these crazy filters, right, that are cutting a bunch, and they're all kind of like really dramatic in this way of like, you still have, you still have something that is along these means. Well, one approach that you can take in order to kind of play along between these is, instead of thinking about stacking the sounds in this way, because eventually like some frequencies are going to stack in amplitude, you can play with the mix in between these along with the movement in order to get something more complex. And so this would take a long time to set up, so I kind of just want to introduce this to you in that way. But you don't have to frequency split. You don't have to make things more complicated than they need to be. It's just a matter of getting into the idea of exploring in order to find new sounds, in order to find those things. Add that on top of the other processing that we do with effects, and suddenly you have a whole brand new world of neuro-based sound design that you can get into. Then you start thinking about changing the source sound. Then you start thinking about applying FM. You start thinking about granular synthesis or changing the pitch or whatever, and suddenly you may or may not be a master of sound design. Today we're actually going to be building just kind of like a Neurobass from scratch, kind of from start to finish. Now it's going to be kind of MPE minded, and this is all in regards to how I made the Eternum pack. If you don't know what that is, here's a quick example. And the kind of theme about how I'm building these patches as of late is to combine the elements of having the neuro type qualities also with the generative qualities all in a single patch with the power of phase plan, which is, I don't think that this would be possible to do in like a single instance otherwise. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start to kind of look at the mechanics and look at some more in-depth effects that kind of fall outside of filtering and such to kind of build something that's, I guess, quote unquote neuro type quality. So what I'm going to do is I am going to make a quick setup before I go any further in this. I did pull up a patch. This was just for me testing the sound. But the first thing that I want to do is I want to look into multipass, and I'm going to pull up a preset that I have. There is a free preset that's available in the Discord that already has this, and it's just the fundamental thing that kind of is like basically the master default preset here has kind of allowed me to kind of skip a couple of steps on this. And what it basically does is I have a master mix now. So anything that I put into the multipass, I have this knob that's a macro over here, and this is dictated by the mix functions that you have over here. And one thing to note about multipass is that this isn't in serial. These are all running in parallel. So what that means is that if you take the mix out here, then all of these other things that are still applied are still kind of going out. And so it's important to know that kind of signal chain. I've also got this set up in Snap Heap as well. I'm not really sure what I'm going to be doing today because it's going to be from scratch, but keep that in mind. Now, the other thing is that I initially had the plan on part one to kind of build off of that first bass that we did, but unfortunately due to hard drive failure and, the debacle that I've had with my Apple M1 computer, I've kind of had to restart, but that's okay because you get to see the same practice again. Okay, so I am going to go a little bit fast through the initial building prospects of this, but keep this in mind with the master mix, and then you'll see me pull things up like that within Snap Heap as well. Actually, let's go ahead and do that because I'm sure that I will use that, and then we will get to building our actual preset. All right. Here we go. So let's go ahead and take care of some easy stuff. I'm going to set the master mix here, and then I'm also going to not touch this because I know that I'm going to do neuro stuff with this, and then if I pull up anything else, I might set it to that macro as well. I'm going to go ahead and start with a nice easy saw wave. And then let's give it some detuning. I'm going to turn the voices down to 2. And then let's give it some synthetic movement here. I like the synthetic thing. It just sounds like it's tearing, kind of like if you have 2 samples that are offset, like if you were playing it on the timeline. And it kind of just sounds like this. So you get a little bit more of that tearing aspect, and I really enjoy those types of sounds that are on that. The next thing that we're going to do is pull up some nice and easy distortion on the overdrive. Nice and chunky. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab a filter here and push this before the distortion. So on this end, I'm going to turn the slope up, and this is kind of like one of my key characteristics that I do, because this is pretty much a low pass and a high pass with how wide these cut. So it's a great tool to use when you're trying to do some interesting filtering, but I covered that in part 2. It's really hard for me to like skip explaining things because I'm always assuming that the person that is watching this video has never seen the other videos, but yeah, all that stuff has already been described in my previous videos. So with these two modulators here, we will set the time to a synchronized BPM to some extent, and then we can already get some cool movement on that end. Now, one thing that I'm going to do over here just to help me out is I'm actually going to pull the smooth on this over to this side. So that way, whenever this macro right here does that, it's actually going to turn it into kind of like steppers. Cool. Now, before I go any further, I think that this is just a really easy thing to do, but I'm going to set the note right here to be centered around F, maybe like so. Then I'm going to turn the range down to 24. And this is pretty much just key tracking the speed. And so what I'm going to do here is as this goes up, I'm going to pull the key tracking up a little bit on this instance like that. And so what this basically is going to do is whenever I move this macro, or sorry, whenever I play a higher pitch, in theory, this should move the movement between this filter a little bit faster. So if I pull this down, let's take a look. You can see that it's kind of slowing down a bit. And then I think I need to make that just a little bit more dramatic. So let's pull that up a little bit more. Cool. And you can kind of already tell now that it's not super dramatic, but this just adds a little bit of character to kind of simulate in some way or another the sampler-like qualities that you would get if you were to place a piece of audio in a sampler and then it plays back faster and yada yada, all that stuff. Cool. So from here on, I think that a lot of people talk to me and they're like, hey, whenever you do the randomizers and you start doing routing and stuff, like it's really easy to get lost, but you really want to focus on like, don't while making this patch, for one, don't try to recreate it. But two, the most important thing that you get out of this is just the idea of knowing what randomizers to set up and then just letting that go and make free flow creative choices. But also like having this mindfulness set up into this because it's going to help you make the randomizers a little bit more usable in that way. Does that make sense? Because the randomness is what we cannot control. It's going to do its own thing. However, if we're a little bit more mindful about how we control the speed of the randomness, and then we control kind of, I guess, like the shape of the randomness, then that does kind of like balance things out, at least like a little bit. I'm gonna turn the jitter up on both of these. And then one other thing that you can be mindful of is instead of going over here to a new modulator, you can actually just hit Option click, and then that will create the same macroed, I guess, type of modulator just without any other controls. Does that make sense? It would be over here though. I forget that it always moves over to the right. So we will end up using this at some point, but for now, just so that way you can kind of sort of keep up, there's that. So this is pretty much all you really need as far as an oscillator goes, but I do want to kind of go a little bit deeper. So we'll go into a wavetable and I'll pull up a wavetable of my own. Doesn't really matter. I forgot I don't have my own wavetables anymore. So we'll go into something maybe simple, kind of like a growl. And what I'm looking for is something that still has a little bit of harmonics, but doesn't like lose its shape. So if you look at this stuff over here, you can see that this kind of is reminiscent of a square. This is kind of an I don't know territory. This gross one still kind of looks a little bit softer, kind of like a sine, at least to some extent. You kind of see it's almost square, but still kind of smooth in some cases. And then the further you go up, it becomes noise. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on just playing around this part of a wavetable because it's not too many harmonics. And you really are trying to step away from the idea of like, if you're going to do FM, you don't want to have too much harmonic content within that because then it just becomes like, and there's a time and place for it. But with Neurobass, usually you want to not do that. So let's go ahead and apply the phase to this, and you can start to see that the waveform is kind of multiplying in that way. But instead of just leaving it there, we're going to add some of the randomization patterns to that. And I guess we'll just take that one and then we'll go here. If you click on the yellow button, that means that you're going to modulate the modulator. What? You're going to modulate the modulator, which means that it's going to control whatever this is already moving. And so now, as opposed to it just being already FM'd 100% of the time, it's giving a little bit more movement to this that is kind of morphing the waveform in that sense. Now what we can do is we can multiply or duplicate this, and then we'll have this move across the wavetable. So just a little bit. And now whenever this goes, you'll see that this will start to move and change shape in certain ways. So let's take a listen to that. And so now, without having like any crazy like super effects or anything, we've already started to kind of create some interesting dynamics within that. That's probably not the right terminology, but by dynamics, I mean that it's varied. There's a lot of varied sound within that. Yeah, I don't know. I try to avoid using the same vocabulary. I like tonality a lot, or timbre. Anyways, let's go ahead and create a new group. And what this is going to be is just another, we're going to make this a square, and we're going to make this super detuned, kind of like this. And then we'll give that an output. Let's go ahead and turn this off so we can focus on this one. Right? Now, the first thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to high pass this because we don't want the low end kind of manipulating that in that way. And then we'll turn the curve up because I really don't want that sub there. But we still want some of that low end bite. And now what we can do is we can duplicate that filter, turn it into a bandpass over here, and we can focus on kind of doing some cool stuff where we will take a distortion like this, move that after the filter. I'm moving it after the filter because I want to cut before I boost. That's not really like gospel or anything, but it works a lot of times. But sending the distortion into this bandpass now is going to create something kind of like this. And so now if I add another sense of distortion after that, then what we can do is try and see what this will do now. And you can kind of hear that it's giving that like crazy sound. So if I pull back on this a little bit and focus on just this part of the sound, then when I go and apply another randomizer to it, what I might do is I might try to make it match the cutoff. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to make it match the cutoff in opposition to the notch. So that way, whatever is being notched, it's going to be replaced, in theory, by this little guy here. And that's just like, you know, I don't know. I'm doing this from scratch, but it's just ideas that I have to try to understand the relationship between whatever it is that I'm doing to the sound and then how I can kind of think about like jigsawing it and balance things out or whatever. And it still might not sound good, but that's just the idea anyways, or that's the theory. So now we've got a little bit of an FM saw, and then we've got a little bit of just like that basic square. And if this becomes too loud or whatever, we can always reduce the level in that way. But let's go ahead and take a listen to how that sounds now. Okay, that does sound pretty cool, but I need to control this just a little bit more. So we're going to back off of that, and that way it's not going to go be so dramatic. And then I'm also going to turn this down to like 80% because it almost sounds like two different things pitting against each other. And what I'm looking for specifically is making it seem like it blends. Cool. Let's go ahead and collapse these. We're going to come back to them in just a second, but we can do just some basic things right here where we're going to think about pulling this up, and we're going to boost the low end. We're actually going to keep the mids there, and then we're going to bring the high end there. And again, we're just doing ourselves some favors of having stuff to cut through, and in order for organization to be there, I'm going to just think about keeping this in one lane so you can see what is actually going on. So nice. It's already super chunky in that way. Okay, so anything that I do from here, this is kind of like the source sound, right? And I think it's fine as of now. Anything that I do from here is going to be all geared towards this first macro because this is going to be our neuro macro. And so what that means is that anything that is going to involve a mix of something, anything that is going to involve morphing the sound to something different than the source, that's going to be all going towards the macro. So multipass and snap heap are fantastic ways to kind of manipulate that in such a way. Just be mindful that that's kind of what I'm going for in order to kind of get this to start doing what I want it to do, to be more different, I guess. And you can still have effects on here that are a little bit different in that sense, but it's more so about just being mindful about how this is going to control and morph the sound into something that gives it more of those qualities, as opposed to if you turn everything off, it's still going to be doing things that you don't want it to. So there is a little bit of randomness to this, but it's not so dramatic that I have to turn other things off. Like you can kind of use this sound already just kind of as like a basic movement, kind of like what we were talking about in part one. Hopefully that is relative to you, or hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, let's go ahead and pull up our first multipass. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this, and then we'll move this over here. So that way, if I ever need to like have more or do different things, I can kind of rely on that. Now, we talked a lot about filtering, and you're going to see a lot of that today. And I might even do some filtering outside of multipass. But for now, there's a couple of other things that I really like doing sometimes that really make this kind of stand out. So the first thing that I'm going to get into is kind of just laying out what I normally do for typical neuro processing. I make sure that the low end is in mono over here, and I usually set that to like somewhere on the low 110, 120 or so. I'm going to be using both of these in this way, and it's really important that we kind of make sure that that low end is in mono. And then from here, I might even do some stuff that I'm manipulating over here, and I'll talk about it in just a second, but this is kind of like the most important part that you want to focus on. Let's go ahead and turn that macro up for now as well. Over here, I almost always pretty much do the same kind of filter, which is a high pass over this way. And the reason why is because, like, well, if you do any other kind of thing, unless if you're doing it on the super low over here, it's not really going to do anything, right? I guess you could do a super band pass like this and see how that sounds, right? Okay, that actually sounds kind of cool. Let's go ahead and roll with that and see if that becomes something interesting after. But I'm going to kind of just push this in this way. And then what I'm going to do most likely is I will duplicate this and make this a high pass and pull that back. So that way, let's go ahead and set that opposite. So that way this will kind of hopefully balance out to some extent. You won't be able to hear this if you don't have headphones. Now, one creative choice that we can make with this is actually using the non-linear filter, but I kind of want to keep the low end relatively clean, sort of. So there will be a massive spike within that, so maybe I'll back off of that just a bit. Okay, now on this is kind of where the magic happens. The magic's in the middle, as some people say. And one thing that I like to do quite a bit is use delays on the mid-band that are really short to create some kind of metallic movement. So if we take a listen to this, you can kind of hear from that it kind of has that really cool, like, cybernetic feel to it to some extent. So let's go ahead and use that if we can. And I'm going to go ahead and pull this there. Sweet. Let's go ahead and grab a notch now with the nonlinear filter, and we can kind of focus on a notch here. Now, one thing that I still miss from the nonlinear filter is the slope, because I really feel like cutting this like super wide is pretty essential. However, this will do to some extent because it's not really just being used as filtering, it's also being used as a matter of distortion, right? So by adjusting the resonance here, you can see that you can get some pretty crazy stuff. I'm going to go for digital on this one because I remember this being pretty cool, but let's go ahead and push this up just a bit and let's see how that sounds. And you can hear this, but you want to kind of be mindful about where you're sweeping on this in particular, because if you keep going up further, you kind of get that screechiness or screechy sounds, right? So let's just maybe do something like that. And then we'll kind of just push this here, and then we'll grab that other other random mod, because they're kind of categorized under the same thing. And then now this is kind of moving on its own. Cool. Now let's go ahead and grab that normal filter, and then we're going to push that all the way up. And then we're going to pretty much do the same thing. I'm going to pull this in opposition, kind of like that, so that way it's not sweeping too far over. Because again, I don't really want it to focus on the areas up here, even though it's going that far. I'll adjust it in a second. But now that we have something like that, we can adjust the resonance and pull this more towards the low mid. And I don't care if it dips over here. The reason why it's going to matter up here is because I'm actually going to automate this with a macro, which I'll do later, maybe about that much. And then we'll also maybe macro the speed here and do that with this one as well. Let's just call that speed. And this one is band frequency. And I'm not really concerned. I know that there's probably a phase cancellation issue, but to be honest, like, this is more just for creating like fill bases and like crazy movement, right? So I don't really worry about all that stuff right now. I'll worry about it when it gets to audio and it's already printed. But you can see here that it's starting to transform quite a bit from that. And that's a pretty cool thing. If you want this to be more dramatic, you can turn the feedback up, of course, which might actually even be cool to try to mess with. So if we turn this up to halfway and then turn this down to the bottom, maybe a little bit more than halfway, then we can get some cool stuff as well. Something else that we can maybe mess with is the pitch shifter, and this is pretty fun. It's kind of like, it's a granular effect, grain size, but it essentially does like, well, pitch shifts it, but it does it by taking little bits, almost kind of like a short delay in some case or another. That's kind of what a delay does anyways, but it pitches it up to whatever is matching in that sense. And so by pulling this up or down, you can either create kind of like a pseudo chord out of your bass or out of your sound, or you can do like a bunch of different things. We're going to use this more when we get to the generative aspect of this, but let's just take a listen to what this sounds in case if you want to use it right now. I do think that sounds kind of cool, but the thing to keep in mind is that it's still in key. So if you're going to do something like this, it might be wise to do something that's like a fifth, +7, +9. Sorry, that's a third terminology. But for now, I'm just going to leave this at an octave. And if you really want to make this wonky and you want to break it, like one thing that you can do is pull this here, and then you can actually duplicate this and pull this to -12, and then flip this here and pull that up a little bit, and then let's just see what that sounds like. Yeah, it's a little bit overboard, but sometimes you can get away with it. Now that we have something like that, let's go ahead and talk about some other things that we can do. For one, we can add a chorus to this, which sometimes can sound pretty nice. I'm going to pull the delay down a little bit and just pick something here to modulate. And that's pretty much what I do, is like if I wanted to move, I have a easier choice between these two, and I'm just like, okay, modulate. And that makes things a little bit easier for me. Something else that's important is that if you do something like this is a cool little trick. Sorry, I just thought of it. But what you can do is, let's say you're taking away a lot of frequencies with something like a bandpass. Right? Which can sometimes be useful. What you can do is, for one, you can actually set this to keep the bandpass on, but you can actually pull the mix down from this to make sure that even if this is at full %, this will take over and pull this mix down to kind of make everything a little bit cleaner at times. Regardless of if it has a bandpass or not. So now that we know that, we can kind of combine the two between that and kind of do something in the low mid region. Maybe give it a little bit here. And then I'm also going to pull this over towards before this kind of distortion type thing. Cool. All right, let's keep going. Yeah, like I said, the magic is in the middle to some extent. Let's go ahead and bring some of that stuff back with just a touch of distortion. We don't really need that much, but maybe a little bit. There we go. And now on the high end, it's kind of up to you. I usually don't do much, but just for the sake of funsies, let's try a flanger or so. You can get away with a lot more distortion on the high end. And in some cases, it's a wise idea, because usually the first thing to go whenever you do filtering is more of the high end. But if you kind of just blow it out of proportion, or like you put too much stereo on it, then it can actually like falter the entire sound. So I'm going to see what we can get away with maybe just a little bit of this and see what that does. Okay, so I can't hear it that well because all the other stuff is going on, but let's go ahead and solo this. And I really want to try to emphasize the tearing aspect of this. Cool. And now we can kind of manipulate the stereo mix, or not the stereo mix, but the mix in general just a little bit with one of these. Doesn't really matter. And it's just, again, for the sake of movement. Cool. So why does this matter now? Well, because we are kind of doing a couple of checks here. The first thing that we're doing is, remember when I was telling you just about the bandpass filter that we have here, right? Okay, well, if this band is all the way up here, then this is going to cut everything that's not this. So what you can do to kind of make this a little bit more usable, hence the beautiful thing about macros on this in particular, is that you can automate the band frequency on one of these just a little bit. And you can pull that up to some extent. Now what I did was that if you look here, this means that it's only going to go up to wherever this is, and that means that it's only going to go up from here. So normally this would typically be at like 3K, but from pulling this down a little bit and pulling that up, that means that it's going to allow the bandpass to control a little bit more of the mid and high mids in between that. Now what we can also do is we can grab the note here and map that to the speed. And so whenever we play that with a higher pitch, you'll see that the speed will kind of go up as its own macro, right? Pretty sick. Okay, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and pull the master mix down and let's listen to that. And as you can hear, we pretty much have the source or the bass sound, basic sound, fundamental sound of that. And so if we kind of like retrace some of our steps and backtrack a little bit, if you look right here with macro 1, that would be where we would activate our MPE to this. So I don't have an MPE device connected, but taking a look at the modulators here, the pressure is mapped to the macro. So the harder that I would normally press a key, the more that it would activate the neuro aspect of this. So taking a look, right? That's kind of the first part to that. But there's more that I want to do to this. So that's kind of just a simple like way that you can put something together. And again, like from all these racks that I have from something like Eternum, you can see that all the things that I've created here are pretty much in that design. But the most important thing that if you're trying to create a patch like this is regardless of what you do with processing, and it doesn't even have to be neuro, like this could be for like making like cool evolving bells or pads or whatever, but having the master mix on this is such an important key towards making this work to have something that's really cool for a source sound or whatever, and then activating the extra stuff, right? So let's go ahead and talk about some more things that we can do because this is not done. As lengthy of a video as this has become, it's a comprehensive guide. So what can you say? So what I'm going to do now is I am going to do a little bit more interesting movement with the slice EQ, and I'm going to bring back some of the stuff that we would normally be losing. What I am going to place here is a notch and a boost, and then I'm actually thinking about placing another small boost that's geared towards the low mids, kind of like right here. And let's go ahead and open the filters over this way, and now I think I'll add just another randomizer over here, and I'll focus on the cutoff on this one is going to match in opposition the notching with this one, and then over here I'll grab a different modulator, doesn't really matter what it is, and I'll pull the cutoff down to here. And let's just adjust that a little bit. So now we've got some kind of moving stuff that you can see is doing interesting things. Now, like we had talked about before, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the mix over this way and turn that up, and then turn this down all the way. So that way, again, this is only moving whenever the neuro stuff is activated. Cool. You get the idea, right? Hopefully. So the final things that I usually like to do, and we can go more into this, like we can do comb filtering within the multipass. We can also set up like external effects that are outside of this if we wanted to. So let's say we wanted to make it a little bit more not metallic. We can go ahead and just kind of pick and choose from whatever we want. Maybe we want to do something like this. And then again, we'll set the mix over here to kind of be on that sense. So take a listen to this now. You can hear that the comb filter is pretty dramatic, so it might be wise to kind of pull back on that. Or what you can do is kind of dial back on this just a little bit and find the root of the note, or the root note, which is F is like usually 345-ish. I'm sure someone in the comments is going to be like, it's this specific frequency number. Don't be that guy. It's somewhere around this region. So now that it's here, we're kind of playing around this frequency range in order for it to bite through like the upper mid harmonics of that. Which actually sounds kind of cool. Maybe we don't want this to be a full mix. Well, it doesn't have to be all the way. So you can just introduce just a little bit of it to give it some of that quality. But you can start to see already that by making these small, subtle changes to this stuff, it's really making a dramatic feel. So just for the sake of funsies, I'm going to keep this at a pretty low mix there, and then we'll kind of adjust more later as we go on. So there's two final things that I do on here, and I'm not going to go through like every single effect down here and talk about how it could work. It's more of like, if you don't know what these effects are, then that's the most important thing, is like learn those effects, because that's what's going to help you figure out how to make this stuff work, right? Of like, hey, I'm in multipass. Well, what do I do? Why did you make these choices, right? It's because I'm trying to be aware of what it's doing to what it's doing to the sound. And so if you don't know that stuff, then as opposed to just following what I've just done, this is really important, guys, or what you should do rather, is put every single effect on that frequency band and then put a randomizer on it and see how it changes the sound over time. Because I haven't explored all the options. There's an infinite matter of combinations that you can do with this. And so that's why it's really important for you to just try stuff out, because otherwise you're never going to know for yourself. You're just going to be kind of following your YouTube tutorials. That is fine up until a point, but if you really want to understand this stuff, you have to do the exploration on your own. So since we have this back open, one more thing that I might want to add to this, just for the sake of being like, all right, well, here's some other stuff you can do, is just a little bit of frequency shifting. Now this is going to be really cool because like, on one end, it was really salty that frequency shifter didn't have a mix on it, and then I understood that it was probably meant for the sake of multipass, but it's only going to activate whenever this mix is pulling up anyways, so you'll get kind of like this warping effect whenever you use it to a low rate. If it's really fast, you're not even going to be able to hear it, but this is kind of what it sounds like. Let's make it dramatic. All right. You're probably not even going to be able to tell, to be honest, but throw a frequency shifter on the outside of any DAW that you have, and then you'll be able to see what it does. So let's go ahead and give it some compression after that to try to control the dynamics. And one thing that you want to be mindful of is like, and I'm not the best at this, but I do try to keep it in mind, is that there's going to be changes in amplitude whenever you throw this stuff in here. So if we turn all this stuff off and listen to what it sounds like, right, and then we turn this on, you can see that the change in that is a lot more dramatic. And so some stuff that we'll do at the end of this, I keep saying like one more thing. I'm sorry, it's because I get excited over this, is because, or one thing that we can do is add a little bit more like crunchiness to the high end. So we can go into user and we'll go into ocarina to time. Get it? All right, bad joke. Go take the overachiever preset, turn off the bottom, turn off the top, set the mix to 50%, and you've got essentially what would be an OTT. And then we're going to grab this one here at the bottom and just make sure that our low end is in mono. It's really important. So stereo, mono, the mix needs to be all the way up for that one. That's pretty much what you can do with that one in that sense. Then we can go ahead and add a dynamics over this way and crunch the heck out of it, kind of like so. And then we can kind of bring everything back up to make it really loud with the limiter. Now, for me personally, because of my headphone situation, I actually make everything way louder than it needs to be in an actual mix, but it's fine. Just turn it down if it's too loud in your tune, right? It's not supposed to be like ready. It's supposed to be like, here's something inspiring and now make changes to it. That's why everything is randomized in the first place, just to be mindful of. So yeah, I guess since we're on the subject here, what we can quickly do is we can maybe even look at bringing up a sense of snap heat. So if we go like this and we want to do some processing like that, like maybe you don't want to do some frequency splitting or whatever, you want to do something that's more in the sense of band splitting. So what I mean by that is instead of this being frequency dependent, it's just 1 band, 2 band, 3 band. And this is just kind of some stuff that you can do to kind of set up some interesting filter situations to create more dynamic stuff. What I'm going to do here though is I'm going to create a relationship between these two. Because this is going to have super dramatic processing in between, on this one, I'm actually going to set the mix to be all the way up. And on this one, I'm going to set the mix to be all the way down. And then I'm going to interpolate between these with a randomizer here. Okay, so you're not going to be able to tell because the master mix is already on that, but rest assured they'll be doing different things. But now that this is in parallel, then I pretty much have full control to kind of mess with this in any way that I want. So maybe what we can do is focus on, like, I'm going to try to make this a little bit more simple just for the sake of time. I'm just kind of, again, showing you possibilities. But let's go ahead and take that short delay, kind of like this. And then we're going to move that down. And then what we'll do is send this through a bunch of different things here. So that'll be there. We're going to go to this LFO and kind of morph that between something like this. So something kind of like so. That's way too far. I want that to be more so focused over in this position. And then we can kind of set something else up like a pitch shifter, maybe like here. Keep the mix kind of consistent now so that they're not going to be moving together. Turn the correlate on. Let's go ahead and just focus on this one for now. Cool, and we can create another delay now. Nice, that's what I was looking for. We'll go ahead and place that there so that way it morphs in between. And then we will probably end up just doing that with the filtering at the bottom. Cool, so with this one, let's go ahead and kind of do the same thing. We're just going to use a notch filter, and then we're just going to cut everything through this with this one, kind of like so. And we'll take this one. That's still on LFO, so I need to change that, but we'll mess with it here in just a second. But there's that. Change that to random. Let's go ahead and push that through a distortion. And then we'll also play with maybe a phaser on here. That sounds pretty cool. So now these are in parallel. So you can kind of set it up however you want. But one last thing that we also want to do is we want to go to the macro 3, which will also be dictating the speed. We're going to pull that up to like halfway. Go to this one, also pull that up to halfway, and then label that as speed. Sorry. PEED. And now between this, we can go to the outside of that and do the same thing with the note. So we'll go here, and that will dictate the speed. Yay. All right. As you can see, like the depth of complexity that you can get into one of these patches is pretty extensive to say the least. Working between all these things, right, I think the last thing that we'll get into is maybe just some compression, and that will allow us to kind of like try to control everything in between these two to some extent. But as you can see, let's go ahead and turn that down. Once we turn this up, it's going to, sorry, we also didn't map that yet. So now we'll map this. But now as we turn everything up, everything activates, everything doesn't activate. All right. So let's go ahead and finish this puppy up. Let's go ahead and add one more multipass. I lied. One more snap heap because we don't need to frequency split, but we're going to add one more instance of snap heap on this. And no, I lied. We're just going to use this one because that's going to be easier. On this band, what we will do is we're going to keep everything at 100%, but we're going to add in a low pass filter. And then after that, we're going to add in a reverb. Okay, so the reason why I do this is one of my favorites. And the reason like I think that it just sounds super cool is because it's kind of like the finishing touch to making everything sound like it has like, how do you say, the ultimate like morphing sense. And I just get a kick out of making this sound spacey to some extent. So the easiest way to do this would be to automate the reverb with these two, but it's going to change with the speed. But actually, I kind of wanted to show you like that you can do that, but actually what I really want to do is instead, I'm going to set these to their own macros, actually to their own macro in general. So these two are going to be dictated by this macro and this macro here. But what I'm going to do is move the cutoff all the way over here and turn this up all the way. So that way it's always going to at least have a little bit of sub, but it's kind of be able to do its own thing. I lied. I want these to be independent as well. So we'll set this macro over here to kind of be its own thing as well. So we'll call this low pass, or just low, and then we'll call this re for reverb. And then I want these two to be controlled separately from this. And again, guys, I'm doing this from scratch, so bear with me, okay? Let's go ahead and move these separate, and then I'll grab another randomizer here, and we can pull this up to this. Let's go ahead and look at what this does if this is at 100% on our CPU. I'm on a good PC, so your PC might be melting right now, but whatever. Oh, we're okay. Right. So the reason why I wanted these to be a different placement is because I actually want these to be faster than the other stuff, because I want this to really take in the low aspect of that. Cool. Now, this is really cool, and I'm going to keep that, but I'm going to show you a different way that you can do this too, just because it's more information, and you're probably melting your brain right now. Sorry. You said you wanted in-depth stuff, and so we're going to do that. All right, so this is going to be turned on, and we're going to pull this down to here. And so what that is going to allow us to do is that whenever this comes on, it's actually going to activate the low-pass filter. But we can take the same one right here and mess with the cutoff and turn this up, something kind of like that. Oh, sorry. What I meant to say was what we'll do instead is we'll take this and then place it on the gold. So that way, whenever this is activated, it'll start to turn on. Cool. Now we can make that more dramatic. There we go. But when this is at here, this shouldn't really mess with it. So it's a little bit more complex modulation in that sense, but I do find that it's worth it because it will give you more varied sounds. Then we'll do the same thing with the reverb to that sense as well. So we'll grab one here and then we'll pull this down. I'm not really concerned about how the reverb is going to stack. I imagine it's actually going to make it sound cooler anyways. So we'll just pull that up there, and then we will dictate the macro here to the depth of that, of how much it's actually going to control. So when this is all the way down, it's not doing anything. When it's time to go, it's going to wake up and it's going to do its own thing. So you can see that like when this is turned on, like this means that all the processing is going to go through this. And this is just like one possibility that you can go through that. And again, guys, if this doesn't sell you on why Faceplant is the best synth on the planet, well, I don't know what to tell you. So yeah, let's take a listen to our final sound, and then we'll end the video and we'll talk about part 4 when the time comes. So to build off of that, there's a couple of different things that we can do in order to achieve some interesting results. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about randomizers in part 1 and 2 and 3, and we are going to kind of continue to develop off that theme, except we're going to do something a little bit different here. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to the pitch here up to maybe 24. And the reason why I'm going to keep it at 24 or that amount is just because it's not too drastic, but if you're doing this with pitch bending, it'll kind of, you can make it more dramatic in that way. However, the more important thing that we need to do with this is that once we have the modulator on here, we need to come over to this set and make sure that macro 2 is modulating how much this goes. And the reason why is because whenever we have this off, we want to make sure that the fundamental is playing at the pitch it's supposed to be, which is F. It's always F. But whenever we turn this on, it should be starting to do some other things, kind of like this. As you can tell. So we're going to need one more of these things too, because I think that what I want to do is I want to change the speed of this just a little bit and make sure that it's not kind of the same thing. And again, what I'm trying to pull from the meaning of generator is I want the most variety of sound that I can pull out of this as possible. So So as you can tell, this is going to kind of start to do its own thing and have some fun with it. And there is pretty much the first aspect to that. So now that we have that and it's creating different pitches and stuff, what we're going to do is pull up another instance of multipass. And this is going to be more so catered towards kind of, I guess, more effects that are going to be focused on changing the pitch side of things and also the stereo aspect. But really, as opposed to trying to make the sound cooler, it's more so about like, how do we break the sound the most? So one easy way that we can do that is by grabbing something kind of like a pitch shifter. If you grab this at 100% and we take a listen to how this sounds, just, well, I guess, observe. Sorry, one thing that I forgot to do is map this to the master mix here. I was like, why isn't this working? So now that this is on 100%, then this will actually start to do things. So we can pretty much take something that sounds interesting like that and grab this here and go into the full range. Actually, let's not do that. Let's go into like half range here and then set this to be normal. So this is going to go up 12 and down 12 respectively. The other thing that we're going to do, kind of like what we did in the last video, is we're going to grab this and just set this macro to the speed of these here, kind of like so. And then at some point we will add another randomizer here to mess with the speed to manipulate that even further. So the pitch shifter is great, and there are a lot of different things you can do, and sometimes it might even be worth like stacking these in some way or another. So maybe what I'll do is I'll grab the other one here and I will set this to go the opposite way, kind of like so. And you never really know what you're going to get whenever you start to mess with stuff like this. And sometimes like even messing with the grain size can give you some interesting things too. So cool. I don't think that we need to keep that, but just as a means of exploration, I am doing this from scratch and I'm not recreating the same exact thing that I did last time, so bear with me, yeah? So one thing that I do think would be cool though is messing with the comb filter, and this, when it's set at 100%, can end up getting us some interesting results. So let's take a listen to that. So let's go ahead and grab one of those and kind of just set that to do what it wants to, kind of there, but let's go ahead and set that to minus and turn the stereo on. Interesting. So that seems pretty cool to me. And now maybe what we can kind of focus on is going between some of this stuff to try to get some interesting, I guess, artifacts. And that's really kind of like what I'm looking for within this stuff, is just to see like how many artifacts or what kinds of artifacts I can pull from that, if that makes sense. So I turned this down just a little bit so that way it doesn't go past the point that it was originally at. Because if you get into too much distortion, then, well, you ruin the sound in the wrong way. But Alckemy, we're trying to ruin the sound. Yeah, I know, but there is a matter of taste to this. So the next thing that we'll take a look at is the delay. And typically in the past, what I've done is I've used it kind of like having short delays and stuff right here. But if you kind of build a stack of this, then sometimes you can end up getting some interesting stuff too. So maybe we'll take this one here on the midband, I guess, and then we'll duplicate that and then change that to, I guess, something different. Sure, doesn't really matter. But we'll grab the other one now from here, and then we'll start doing different stuff on this one. So let's take a listen to what that sounds like. Okay, that sounds pretty sweet. So let's go ahead and do some more stuff with this now. I think that it would be kind of cool if we turn the width down and that way forced everything into mono in that way. And then everything that we do that's processing after this stuff can kind of like go into maybe breaking that even more. Because like you've got phase cancellation that's obviously super apparent through all the stereo things that we're doing here. But if we kind of force everything down in that way and then maybe mess with some of the parameters here, then we can get something else that could be interesting. So I don't know, let's just pull that down and then see what that does. Okay, that's kind of cool, but a little bit overboard, yeah. Okay, that's pretty sick actually. So now what we can do is maybe think about doing something with slice EQ over here. And I'm just going to do something nice and easy. That way it's not too difficult and too complicated. And again, like the thing about multipass and snap heap is that while we do have a lot of versatility, the thing that does hold us back is the fact that we can only modulate so many things between these two. I think like, I want to say maybe like 20 things, which to be fair, like is a whole lot. But at the same time, you'll find that you can kind of get through this pretty quickly. So on this, I just kind of created this little vocal looking thing, and that's just going to make this kind of do some talking. This goes and caters more towards the filter side of things, but if you kind of mess with this in this way, then you'll end up getting something that's kind of like this. Okay, pretty sweet. So now that we have something kind of like that, I think what I want to do is also modulate the feedback between these, or maybe not modulate the feedback, but just kind of mess with that because it's kind of overpowering the sound, right? Okay, that sounds a lot better to me actually, just by pulling off of the feedback. So maybe I'll do that on this one too, because I want it to be like kind of apparent, but not so much that it's just like, you know what I mean? It ends up just sounding like the actual effect that you have. So we'll go ahead and try something like this now. See what that does. And maybe I will pull this to 6 voices instead, because 16 is quite a bit. So let's take a listen to what that sounds like. Okay, that sounds pretty sweet. Let's go ahead and focus on the high band, and let's see if we can get some interesting movement through the chorus. All right, cool. So basically playing off of that stuff, now what we can do is kind of go into pulling the spread back just a little bit and then maybe adding some instances of reverb here, kind of like so. And again, like it doesn't really matter what you do at this point, like just try anything and everything. And that's really what this comes down to. We can also maybe focus on like putting this through maybe something like a non-linear filter. So maybe we can color this a little bit by placing this within a notch and then going into something like digital. And then maybe we can mess with, instead of this here, because we'll probably end up keeping that there, but maybe we can mess with kind of like the degree of what kind of distortion we apply through that. That looks good. And this actually belongs somewhere up here. So we'll take that and start to mess with that. And this way. And again, guys, I know that this sounds terrible right now, but it's okay, because at some point or another, when everything starts to click, it'll start to make a lot more sense, and you'll be like, oh, that sounds so much cooler. But that's kind of part of it, is sometimes you just have to, it takes a while to get there. So now what I'm going to do is I am going to mess with this a bit, and I'm just going to leave this delay right here and let it do its own thing, but we will mess with the mix a bit, kind of in that sense, and then we'll also turn the ping pong on. So let's see if that does anything cool. Cool. All right, kind of like that. Let's go ahead and grab this over here and duplicate that over this way. And I think that is actually pretty darn awesome. But what we might want to think about now is figuring out a way to pull the sound back in order to control it a little bit tighter, because the delays and stuff that you have are really interesting in that way. So maybe one thing that we can try is actually messing with the feedback aspect of this. Okay, we've already done that. So let's go ahead and grab this one instead and start from there. That way it's not going to be doing that the whole time. But then what I also want to be thinking about doing is just figuring out other ways that we can try to get more kind of like, how do you say, like staccato glitches as well. And so one instance that you can do is, if you do it right, then you can get away with it. But basically, if you have this at 100%, then whenever you mess with this in this way, it's actually going to change the pitch. But you have to be careful, because sometimes it can be a little bit too prominent. So let me show you what I mean. So maybe what we can do is we can try to focus on pulling this down just a little bit, maybe like here, and then also keep it like very short in this way. And then maybe what I might even do is see if I can mess with the feedback, and let's see what this does. Okay, maybe what I might try as well is instead of keeping it there, I might even pull it just after this one. Cool. You can also do this like on different bands as well. Like let's say like it makes sense to do it on the whole band, but you can even start splitting this up to different things and make it go like absolutely insane by placing that same kind of idea of different pitches on here. So it kind of starts to break the rules of everything related to, I guess, like the frequency bands, right? Because these two, or I guess these three, if you had something like this, would just start to do its own thing completely. So take a listen to this. And so like if you have something kind of like that acting independently of all of the other bands, then you end up getting like just more stuff to play with. Which to me actually sounds okay. Now that we've got something like that, we can go ahead and grab any other randomizer. Let's just grab this one for keepsake, and then this one will manipulate the speed of macro 2. So that way, right now we have everything set up to where macro 1 is affecting the speed of the neuro stuff, where that's kind of turned on. So this will kind of just act as independently of what's controlling the speed of macro 2. And I will say that like some part of me wanted to set that up that way on purpose, but you'll end up like seeing whenever you start working with randomizers about how you can kind of build synergies between stuff like that. And that's really what the cool part of this is just figuring out different synergies that these effects kind of can do to each other to see how you can pull the most, I guess, interesting stuff out of this. So let's go ahead and mess with this for just a little bit. I'm just going to hold F for a bit, and I'm going to start to mess with changing the neuro knob, and then we also need to rename this to generator knob, or macro, or whatever you want to call it. And what I'm looking for isn't so much as what this sounds like when both of these are turned up to the max or to the bottom, but more so about what happens when we start subtly tweaking these in between. And that's where I think this will start to make the most sense. So let's go ahead and start from 0 and give it a shot. Okay, that does sound pretty cool to me, but I think I'm going to move some stuff around. So for one, I think that I'm going to move this over here. And then I also think that I am going to move that there and move this here. And then let's see what happens if I move the saturator to the top end. And that's the cool thing about multipass and faceplant in general, is that it makes it really easy for you to kind of mix and match and try to see like where, I guess, the right effects or the wrong effects or whatever kind of fit best. Like it might even be better to put the pitch shifter over way far to the right as well. And it, you know, there is no right or wrong. It just depends on how it sounds, but you can see like by doing this kind of stuff, like you will see that it will make a huge difference. So to me, I think that stuff actually sounds a lot cooler. And what we've done is we've kind of cleaned up the high end, except for the distortion aspect of it. We're focusing on like doing cool stuff to the middle, and you can kind of even do other and more things to it. But that's kind of where building a relationship with the effects and how they work with each other starts to come into play, right? Because maybe the saturator needs to be making noise sounds before it goes into the reverb, before it goes into the distortion, in order for it to get that specific timbre. Or maybe instead, the slice EQ needs to be somewhere over here, and the nonlinear filter should be over here somewhere, to kind of just see how what effect you, or what result you get from this affects, you know, this chain of effects. Does that make sense? Like there's not really a right or wrong way to do this, but these are the kinds of things that I look for, that I try to be open-minded to whenever I'm creating sounds kind of like this in general. So So one thing that I actually really like about this in particular is that in some cases, now that the reverb is at the end along with the delay, you end up getting some really interesting, like wide sounding things. And so maybe one last thing that we can try is to just try to manipulate this there instead, so that way it's not always the same delay. Cool. And now that we have something like that, we can go back to trying to play between the neuro and the generator aspects of that. Okay, I lied. Now, one thing I talked about from before was the fact that, like, with the delays and stuff, you get that crazy kind of like cutting sound, that pew pew, and I don't really like. So instead, what I might try to focus on is only doing this maybe up to 0.5% on this. Okay, that sounds pretty darn cool. So let's listen to this really quick. All right, sick. So what I think I'm going to do on this, because it kind of sounds kind of like creepy and crawly, I guess, to some extent, is I will throw a disperser on here, and I'm going to mess with both the amount and also, maybe not that far, maybe like this far, but with the amount and then also the, I guess, the pitch of this. So let me scroll down a little bit more. Maybe have just a little bit of pinch in general. And then one final thing that I think that we'll do just to make this super cool is we'll add a ring mod to this. And this is kind of to get like a cool, like creepy crawly sound, or to get a transformer sound depending on what you send through it. But if you turn the frequency down all the way and you mess with the spread, then you end up getting some interesting stuff kind of like this. And it's just subtle enough that you can't really like tell a whole lot about what it's doing. But I'm just going to set this up just a little bit. And maybe what I'll do is keep this at 100 or maybe 50%. Cool. And now when we play everything together. Oh, man. So one thing to consider is that this is MPE minded, so pushing one button between these two macros, or having the ability to control both of these macros just with the one press of the key, and then maybe messing with the pitch wheel of this, I guess, which is a third dynamic of the MPE, right? You get some crazy stuff. Now, I don't have my MPE controller on right now, but just messing with this. Oh, dude, it's so cool. So the last thing that I want to talk about with this is that it doesn't have to be neuro and generator. I was talking about this before with like rerouting things on multipass in the effects section as well, but you can also bring stuff over here in this way. It's going to take a second because it's moving a lot of effects at the same time. But sometimes putting the generator stuff before the neuro processing, or maybe somewhere in between, can also give you some really cool stuff. So let's take a listen to that. So I personally think that having the multipass at the end was better, but for you, it might be different. And now that you have something like this, you have some kind of cool thing to play with. And maybe let's say like you're listening to this and it sounds kind of cool, but maybe something is going wrong with the top end on here, right? Well, you can always like take stuff away. You can always turn things off. And that's really important to know that. And that's why it's also even more important that you're not trying to copy this patch, because it's more about showing you how to explore with sound design, about how to figure out how to build, I guess, a knowledge base or a database, or like whatever you want to call it, but just building an understanding between how all these things work together. And to me, that's why Faceplan is probably the best learning tool for sound design in general, because it has such a wide range of effects and allows you to just stack things and put them together super efficiently. All in all, let's go ahead and play that sound one more time just because I'm having a good time. Today, we're going to be talking about external processing. And one reason why I want to talk about this is because even though I try to make everything within the patch of Faceplant, not everybody has that. And so if you have something like Bitwig or you have something like Ableton, this should be pretty seamless in that way. And it's just kind of one of those things that like you start to think about what you can draw from. And I kind of like want you to take today's lesson with a grain of salt because you might not have the tools available with modulation, say if you're in Logic or if you're in FL Studio or something, but you can still find some workarounds and you can still kind of like find different ways to get that modulation. And worst case scenario, like you can always do automation, right? So if let's say I pull something up and modulate an EQ or something, you can always do things in that way. It's just kind of inconvenient, right? So I kind of just want to pre-frame that. Let's go ahead and talk about what we can do externally. Now I'm going to show you some typical bass processing that you would do outside of this, and then also a way to kind of try to compress the heck out of it in order to make it usable. The mindset behind this is that we've got a lot of crazy sounds with huge dynamics, both in the frequency range, in the stereo space, and also within being loud and quiet at the same time. And so in order to control that, one idea that we can do is to try to compress it more and try to make everything level towards the end. So that way it's a little bit more usable and everything is kind of a consistent volume, but we'll get there when we cross that bridge. So let's go ahead and talk about some things that we can do right now. One thing that I like to do is pull up a Pro Cue. And if you've seen part 2 of a comprehensive guide to Neurobass season 3, then you'll know that I like to do some cool band boosting and notching and stuff. And so what we can do is we can actually use an external EQ around here to kind of sweep these frequencies here and then maybe start to try to dip some kind of lower area right there because that's where the mud is, and use a modulator right here to kind of move between this. Because if I come in here and I turn all this stuff off and I pull this up, you can see that you can get some really cool kind of talking phasing things around there. So what I'm going to do is I am going to find frequency 1 right here, and I'm going to add a random modulator. And again, as I said before, what you can do is kind of just set a multi-stage envelope as automation, because that's pretty much the same thing, right? Or you can go into something like Ableton and then just grab an LFO and then make it random. Or you can use the shaper, which is a different multi-stage envelope. I'm going to come over here this way, and this is going to kind of move on its own. So whenever I pull this up, you'll see that it's doing its own thing. Now again, I kind of want to be mindful of the frequencies that I'm pushing into this, because if it starts to get too high, then it becomes a little bit more screechy, and I don't like screechy or squelchy. So cool. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one, and I think that I'm actually going to make this one a notch. I'm going to pull the resonance down here, and I'm going to hold Option. And now we've got 2 of these. And so on this one, double click, I'm going to find frequency band 2, or band 2 frequency rather. Band 2 frequency. And I'm going to move this downward and this way. And so now these should be moving at the same time, just in different places. And see how this is sweeping more of the sub region? I'm just going to move this up a little bit, so that way it's kind of moving alongside and sometimes interpolating between this section right here. There we go. So let's listen to how that sounds. Now I will say I do think that this is, yeah, it's on, so that's why it's kind of pitching around in that way, but cool. Now what we can do is we can look at adding just a bit of saturation here to try to mellow this stuff out. You don't really want to do a whole lot with this. I mean, you can if you just want to like create like, but I don't, that's not really what I'm aiming to do. But we can kind of start to apply the same ideologies of filtering, distortion, or the order doesn't really matter. It's just kind of listen to it and see if it's something that you like. So this should be pretty thick now. That low end is pretty rumbly. So we can kind of do the same thing again, where we can pull up a slice EQ now, and this is kind of just a preset setting where this is doing the same thing. I kind of just want to show you how to make it, and then I have this as my default. It's the benefit of having multiple EQs, and now that's going to sound something like this. Now, I'll also say that one thing that we're losing because of this is in phase plant, I have this note modulator right here, and that is kind of like latching to all of the other speeds of the other modulators that we're using. And on this, you can set that up in such a way, but for now, I'm kind of just like showing you the other possibilities. So I guess if you wanted to do that through there, you would just put on key tracking, and maybe what you can do is even use this as a nested device like this. And then I'm just going to show this really quickly just because I mentioned it, but you would go into key tracking here, and then you would modulate everything to whatever it is that you need. And it's really important that you set everything within a nested device. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to apply the same modulator, if that makes sense. But yeah, I'm not really interested in doing that right now just because it's going to take more time. However, we can leave these where they are. And let's go ahead and pull up a vocoder. Now, I'm not going to use this for color base, although you can, I guess. Ugh. But what we can do is we're going to isolate everything at maybe 85 hertz, and we're going to try to leave that alone. And then what we'll do is we'll pull the mix back here and turn the brightness up just a little bit. And then what I want to do is make sure that this over here is to the max. So it's going to start to affect everything that is in between 81 hertz and 20K. Let's just round that up. So the bands right here within this are going to kind of dictate a few different things. If I make this really dramatic, so let's go here. Actually, let's pull that up. That's what we got. So this kind of makes it sound more like physical modeling, where if you have less bands, it kind of sounds like that. I usually do something around 48 bands, and I use this really thin thing here. Getting into this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this up just a little bit. Maybe somewhere around here, and you can start to see that you're getting kind of like that watery sound. Turn the release down, and I'm going to leave this in mono. So here's your mono and stereo mix, and then I'm going to pull this back right here. So that way we have just a little bit. You can kind of set this up however you want, but this is pretty much what I do whenever I am using a vocoder on Bitwig in the first place. And whatever you have, it's going to be different. So I don't want to get too much into the settings or whatever, just slap a vocoder on. But I will say that one cool thing about Bitwig that you can do is you can actually change the carrier within the device itself. So if you wanted to, you can even do something crazy like this, where you pull up an instrument, kind of like phase plant, and you go and pull up a completely different thing, kind of like this. Doesn't really matter. Let's just find something here, this one. And now what this is going to do is, because this has MIDI through, then you can actually send this and make it sound something kind of like this. I'm starting to break this now, but I got to turn that off, that's why. You can actually see that the vocoder is starting to pseudo mix in the signal here, and when you kind of blend those two in together, then you get something. So maybe something that you might want to try instead is with the original master pitch here, you can maybe turn that up by a couple of semitones and see if you get something different or interesting instead. That's pretty sweet, right? Now, for me personally, I usually just stick with brown noise, but if you wanted to change this into something that would be kind of like color bass or whatever, then what you can do is come on over here and make a pad that actually has a specific semitone separation between them. So you can build a chord from this, let's say. And I guess like one downside to that is that whenever you play a different note, then the transposition is going to go along with it. So it's going to make playing chords a little bit more, difficult, but you can always go back over here and use this as an audio receiver and then just have a separate patch that is kind of going to play the chord section that you want. So there's a lot of different options and stuff that you have for that. And I just kind of want to show you this kind of stuff just because there is always more that you can do, even when you think that you're done and you've made the ultimate patch, right? Like the mountain keeps getting higher. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the main frequency thing, the main filtering that I use. I'm just going to show you how this is set up and use this as a possibility, but a default filter rack like this can be incredibly useful, and it's really cool that you have the effect splitter built into into Bitwig in its own right. And if you wanted to do this in Ableton, then you would just do or audio effect rack and then have a low, mid, and high EQ and separate that. There's another thing to cover with, I guess, crossover and phase cancellation and stuff, or you can use an EQ3 and solo the bands, or you can use multi-band dynamics. There's a lot of different options that you can use, but we're still in Bitwig, so we're going to talk about Bitwig. Now, what I've got right here is kind of the same thing that you may have seen when I was using multipass, but on the bottom end, we are filtering everything that is in the low end, so we're going to use a high pass. On the mid band, we are using a band pass. This would also be a good place to use a notch, and then on the high band, we've got a low pass here. Now, if everything was turned on at 100%, this would actually sound really dramatic, and you'd be pulling away from a lot of the key characteristics of the sound. So in order to make that a little bit more manageable, what I've done is added a randomizer on the mix, and that way, kind of like what I was talking about with multipass and snap heap, this will kind of still try to preserve some of the original character that you have before that. So that kind of sounds something like this. And again, we're not turning these knobs on. This is just the source sound. And the thing to consider with this is that maybe in some areas you might want to go a little bit deeper, or maybe you want to build your own custom quote-unquote multipass rack, which this is a great way to do it, even though it's only 3 bands. But what you can do is kind of what I've talked about from another video. So like, let's say you need more bands for whatever reason, then what you can do is come into this and then add another effects rack, kind of like this, and then you can adjust the frequency range in between this a little bit better. Now, unfortunately, it's still going to be between something like that, but you can kind of get somewhat close, and it's still like a little bit more options that you can do to kind of focus on something, or you can just build a single thing like this and just focus on using like the mid section right here, and then focus on building bands. And that way, options. It's so cool though, because like once you kind of, that's, oh man, like, okay, so I really have to talk about like why this relationship has made so much sense to me is like, because you have so much modularity of the idea of being like, oh, what if I throw a multipass within something like this, right? And then I change and solo this in between here. Well, now I've realized that I can do that within a bunch of other synths, within a bunch of other, I guess, things that offer a somewhat modular environment in that way. And that's why there's an incredible duality between Bitwig and Phaseplant whenever you're getting into really complex and crazy sound design. That's how we got here today. I know that like I'm jumping off the deep end and stuff, but I really just kind of want to open your eyes to like how deep this rabbit hole really is and why I spend so much time making sounds like this, because, well, it's just what I have a lot of fun doing, quite frank. So within all that stuff, we can kind of get into, I guess, doing more processing here. I'm kind of going to leave it alone. But one other thing that I'm going to do that might make this a little bit more interesting is something called a pitch shifter. Now this thing is awesome. And the one that's built in within Bitwig is pretty incredible. The pitch shifter isn't quite, it's supposed to be the same thing as what we were using with the kilohertz device, but this kind of has its own characteristic. And so if you end up using something where you're automating or modulating rather everything in between, there's only 3 parameters, which is nice, but you get something like this, then even though the generator aspect and the neuro aspect is turned off, you get some really cool phasing and morphing sounds, kind of like this. So within options, you can either use one of those, you can stack these if you want to, which we're not going to do, but you can use that to your advantage to get something that's pretty incredible. The other thing that we want to talk about is the frequency shifter. And for this particular one, I'm going to use the built-in one. And the reason why is because the frequency shifter from kilohertz is at 100%, and you can't really get the same effect from what we're going to do here. But with this one, again, it's kind of tuning to taste, but if you kind of want that warping sound within this, then you can kind of use something like this with a 50% mix, and then just play with the speed of the shift and range. And this can sometimes sound really cool whenever you do your pitch bending with it. But again, that's just an external effect that you can kind of throw on in between all that stuff. And I guess what you can start to do even is start to mix and match within that way. Or you can stack these, or you can go back into frequency splitting like we had talked about previously. Actually, one strategy that you can do is if you go into the filter rack here, one place that you might want to try to put that frequency shifter is in the middle. kind of like so, because it's going to only focus on like cutting through the meaty part of the sound, but still try to preserve the low end and the high end. And it does become a little bit more subtle in that way, but you can kind of still get a little bit of that characteristic if you want to be more nuanced, if that makes sense. And you can also do that with a pitch shifter as well. Like there's no right or wrong with this. These are just possibilities that we can talk about. So the last thing that I usually do in particular is I might actually kind of do the same processing that I've had on the initial Neurobass patch, where I have some kind of reverb. We can use something maybe like ROM, I think. Yes, native instruments, support for M1 Mac. Beautiful. So what we can do with here is kind of automate the mix in that way. And we can kind of just set its own randomizer to do its own thing. Random. We'll come over here. We'll make this kind of clean in that sense. And then mess with the mix, kind of like so. Maybe not that far. Doesn't really matter where. Just, again, you have to listen to it. That's what's going to be the ultimate thing. And then finally, what we'll do is just grab a low pass filter. So we'll go here, we'll type in filter. I love how fast this is. It makes explaining things a lot easier. And I've already got a randomizer previously set up on this just because it's my default thing that I always use. So we'll turn that up to 100% and then maybe adjust this here and make sure that this becomes bipolar. So bipolar means that it's going to go not only up, but also down. And then what we've got is something that's kind of like this. Cool. Now we've got some issues to cover, and this is going to be probably the most important part aside from the creative aspect of this. But if we go ahead and turn all this stuff on, what we really want to make sure to do is to try to isolate our low end, unless if you want to go for super crazy experimental sounds. Yes, there's reverb on the low end. No, you probably don't want to use this as your main bass. And if you were, then I would turn most of this stuff off and just focus on that initial patch that we had. But if you are trying to use this maybe as like a fill or as like a cool rhythmic part, or just kind of like have more to play with whenever you get to the audio aspect of this, then try to keep your low end in mono. You can also add an OTT from here. What you might want to do instead is maybe think about just pulling up the high end on your own though. So that way you're not losing the mids. So what you can do from here is maybe something like this, or you can even go into the range and pull this up. If you've got a multi-band compressor, then really you're just thinking about trying to see how you can get more high end out of this, and that's what this would be used for. You can also use something like an exciter. There's a lot of different options that you can use with that, but maybe something kind of like this, and then you'll dip the low range down, pull the attack, longer release, and let's see what that sounds like. Cool. And then what you can focus on to have some fun with this is you can start to place all of this stuff, maybe leave the filter at the end, but you can start to place this stuff at any point, or I guess part of the chain, and just see what it sounds like. Sounds a lot different, huh? So finally, some last thoughts that we can do is maybe if this isn't loud enough for you for whatever reason, you can come on over here and grab a glue compressor. This is Cytomic. I mentioned this a lot and I really need to do a review on it, but this is the same compressor as Ableton's glue compressor. It's just a third-party plugin, but you can push the makeup gain 20 dB louder. That's literally the only difference. With that being said, all you have to do is just compress the heck out of it, kind of like what we talked about before. And then with the peak clip turned on, you just start to adjust this until you see the little red thing kind of start to come on in that way. And then now that you've got this crazy chain set up, which hopefully your CPU can handle it, then we can start to again play with the stuff that goes back and forth in between this stuff. And that sounds like a really cool underwater thing or whatever, but what I might do instead is I might pull this up and then just leave that down, because I still want to try to get some of the original character within that. So now let's see if we get something a little bit more open this time. Okay. Pitch shifter is over here. We're going to make these just a little bit faster. And I think that all of the effects are set in place, if that makes sense. But now it's just kind of a matter of changing these to find something that works for us, if that makes sense. So. So it's just a matter of playing from that point on. Now, I think that all this stuff that I have is absolutely excessive. And so probably what I would do is turn all of this stuff off except for the vocoder, the pitch shifter, the frequency shifter maybe, and then the external processing over here. But even still, right, you can always turn things off and turn them back on. And maybe you want to start with too many effects and then start to pull things back until you find something that's cool. And what is important as well is to think about what's doing what, because to me, what's going on right now is that this frequency shifter is actually making it seem like this is controlling the entire sound. So if we pull this off, then suddenly you can see that the amount of variation that you can get in between these sounds becomes pretty vast. Or what you can also do maybe is think about putting a randomizer on the range or shift of the frequency shifter just to make different changes over that. But hopefully, like, you should be able to see the kind of theme that we've got going here in order to be able to kind of do all that stuff. Now, I will say that 9 times out of 10, I do throw an OTT on here, but I've done myself a favor and I don't actually have it downloaded right now. So we're going to avoid it because there are other ways to bring up high end out of your sound. Okay, there's this debate going on right now about why OTT is bad, and that's just silly. It's just something that unfortunately got overhyped and then people started overusing it and not really understanding the aspects of it, but it's not bad. And in fact, in a lot of cases, it can sound good and you can make it work, but learn it. Learn what it does. Learn the characteristics of it as opposed to just slapping it on there, and figure out the whys and hows of why it works, so that way you can use it more so to your advantage and make it sound like your own as opposed to it just sounds like OTT is on there. And that's my 2 cents about that. The last thing that you can consider is that right now this is giving this drive soft clipping, right? So maybe you just want to compress it. Well, a couple other things that you might want to consider just for corrective means is either using an actual clipper. So you can use something like G-Clip and either turn the gain up if you want it to sound busted, or if you want kind of a cleaner sound, then you can go into actual limiting, which we'll go into right here. In between streaming and everything else, we've pretty much maxed out this, but that's okay because this is really designed to like make up the majority of our sound design palette. You can change a lot of this stuff into a pad. You can change a lot of this stuff into percussive means. We'll talk about that in the next video, but I kind of just wanted to show you some processing things that you can do in order to achieve the same results that we did within FazePlant in case if you don't have FazePlant. If you have the ability to build these kind of custom racks and stuff, as in kind of going this way, like doing sound design horizontally, then you have the ability to still create something that is super complex. And worst case scenario, let's say you have to do this all through synths. Well, what you would do is you'd have your source sound and then you would create multiple buses and you would just kind of start to do sound design in that way and start to send things like a crazy person over through, and then at the end automate maybe the master channel from that or something, right? So there are definitely a lot of workarounds. We live in a beautiful golden age of sound design where everything is conveniently placed for us now within a single, I guess, synthesizer. But just because you don't have FazePlant, like maybe you only have Vital, well, get as far as you can in that sense and then go into doing the same ideas, the same ideologies, the same kind of processing outside, right? That's why this is so important, and that's what I really want you to take away from this instead of being like, oh, this person is using this, so I need that too, because that's really not the case. Yeah, I'm definitely an advocate for the tools that I own, and there's a reason why I own them, but that doesn't make your tools any less effective. It just means that you might have to rethink about how you apply those. Does that make sense? Hopefully. So there's a lot of other different things that you can do. We didn't really touch chorus or flanger or phaser or anything like that because we kind of covered those things previously. But once you get out of FazePlant, the same stuff applies. Anything goes. If you know how to frequency split, you know how to band split, you know what's happening to your low end, then go crazy with the mid and high bands, or go crazy with the low end and just create any kind of random thing that you can think of in its own right. One cool thing that we will explore in the future that's outside of the Comprehensive Guide to Neurobass is building a crazy glitch rack with a delay 4. Whatever tools you have, use them. If you've never opened up, like let's say you bought something a long time ago and you never touch it because you haven't taken the time to learn it, well, an excellent place to start is on a bass, and then just kind of see how it reacts, because you might end up using that thing that you neglected for so long, and it could end up becoming the most crazy, awesome tool that you never even knew that you had. So speaking of, if you do have a large suite of tools or something to that extent, then maybe you can pull up something that is a little bit more dramatic, such as something like Portal. Now, I've already got a video on how to use Portal, so I'm not really going to get into detail about how this works. However, I will say that, long story short, if you've never seen this before, it's a granular effect that also has a rhythmic engine built into it. So you have the density knob right here. So as opposed to the grains being played back at random, you can actually set them to be kind of consistent in this way. So check this out. Which is a lot of fun. So you can kind of see that by changing some of the parameters here and all that, you can end up getting some crazy results that might end up inspiring you to get more out of what it is that you're already doing. The last thing that I want to talk about is a delay 1, and you can actually kind of fake a granular synth with this and do some really cool pitching stuff if you set everything to 100% mix and then pull the feedback all the way. You can pull the feedback up to 100% as well if you want to, but we're going to abstain from that just for now. But what you can do is you can change this into time mode, and what this will start doing is so you get some crazy interesting pitching from that, and kind of setting this more towards the low end of things. You can get some cool stuff like that. Once you start to introduce the feedback, I would automate this or modulate this with something in order to get a more bigger variety of sound. But if you take a listen to this, then let's see what that does. Okay, so now you start to imagine having modulators on this with all the other stuff that you have, and suddenly there's quite a bit that you can do. And now that I've given you all of the tools to design the perfect bass, or the most varied bass that you can potentially come up with, the world is your oyster. And I hope that within all of this stuff, it's going to kind of give you some insight about how to get more creative with your sound design and open up the doors to start exploring new sounds that you may have never thought that you'd be able to make. A lot of times the hardest thing to do is figure out how to write bass lines. And today I'm not going to show you the dopest song ever. I'm not really even probably going to show you something that you may or may not like, but I'm going to talk about academic things that you can use in order to create or to implement these sounds that are kind of experimental in that way. So let's go ahead and take a listen to the drum loop that I've prepared for you all. I'm going to go ahead and mute this, and then we'll talk about some different ways that you can start trying to turn this bass into something that's usable within like your main section. So it's a pretty simple kind of halftime beat, and it's not, again, the most complex, it's not the most robust. And keep in mind that like every genre that you produce is going to be a little bit different. So I try to keep it relatively like genre neutral, but at the same time, like the way that you go about mixing and stuff is always going to be a little bit different depending on like how your drums sound in relation to your bass. And that's going to be the first topic that we're going to be covering today, which is sidechaining. You don't necessarily even have to sidechain. It is a good idea if your kick and your low end are covering the similar frequencies. There are other means and ways to solve it. Typically in the past, I've actually gotten away with using an OTT on the master to kind of push everything to the side. I've covered why that works in another video. I'm not saying that's what you should do, but I'm saying that there's more than one way to not only sidechain, but there's also a bunch of different ways to kind of get a clean low end, if that makes sense. So on my bass channel right now, I am using a tool with an audio sidechain that's going to the main drums, which are my fundamentals. So I've got 2 layers of a kick, 2 layers of a snare, and that's pretty much it. And that kind of sounds like this. I'm not really going to talk about the mixing section of this stuff, but in relation to that of trying to get that to fit, I've got a pretty quick attack and just a little bit of a slower release. And that I can do that because I have a lot of space within this particular beat. Whereas if you have something that has a bunch of stuff going on and lots of layers and stuff, and granted, like this is the baby stages of that stuff too, you might actually want to pull your release back to kind of get everything out of the way a little bit more quickly to kind of fill up the space. Actually, it'd be the opposite. If you have more space, then you can use a faster attack to bring in your sub and all that stuff in quicker to help kind of like make it seem more consistent. That's pretty much what I have as far as sidechaining goes. There's a lot of different ways that you can do this. You can put your drums in MIDI and use Gatekeeper. You can do sidechain compression. Just keep in mind that if you have a sustained note and there are no drums playing to sidechain your bass, or like no ghost notes or something, then when you stop the music, it's actually going to bring the volume back up if you have makeup gain. So not everybody uses makeup gain, but those are just some things to kind of keep in mind if you're like kind of a beginner whenever you're making bass lines in the first place. Because I feel like that's one of those things that everybody always talks about. They're like, bro, you sidechaining? Or I don't know, like your first 6 months into music, that's like the most coolest trick that people learn. So just, yeah, don't make it a bigger deal than it needs to be. So one thing that is pretty safe to do is make sure that your low end is in mono. So what I've done is I've got this 2-band split over here, and I'm cutting everything at 125 Hertz. And then I'm making sure that that has 0 stereo signal. When it comes to the top end, there's a couple of different things that you can explore. Right now, I've actually just got a reverb on this, which is pretty small. So the decay is 0.43 seconds out of 45 mix. And the reason why I've got that is because if you listen to maybe a sound kind of like this, it's going to help make everything a little bit wider and give me a little bit more depth in stereo. So let's go ahead and unmute that. And pretty much all the basses have that, and as long as you are being mindful about where you're placing reverb, so there's a low cut right here, making sure that even though this is on the high band, I'm still cutting the low end, then you can get away with stereo enhancement. You can also use stuff like a Haas effect. You can also even use things like a chorus and whatnot. And you can even keep things in mono if you want to. The mixing aspect of it, again, is almost like too subjective, but I want to give you and show you some of the options that you can do instead whenever it comes to trying to make your bassline fit. So as far as getting everything to go and make it sound cohesive, of course, it's always going to depend, and there is no right or wrong, but some things that you can look forward to are trying to make sure that all of the bass sounds that you use in here are like relatively the same volume. So if you've got a bunch of dynamics and like you've got like a crazy, I guess let's say more abstract glitch hop thing where it's a bunch of synths and stuff put together, if everything is a consistent volume, it's going to be a lot easier for them to seem like they blend, and you won't have to fight as much to try to, I guess, make things match in the same world. Another thing that we can talk about is, let's say you've got a bunch of sounds. If you have reverse sounds that lead into the next one, then that kind of gives it like an intro, and that can kind of help you kind of gel everything together in that way. Now, with all the stuff that I'm using here, I haven't even talked about this yet, but one little trick that I do in order to kind of create fills is I send everything into a reverb, and if you listen right here, then it just creates a nice little space. So in context, if you go like this, it kind of creates that fill to help everything, again, gel as well. So that's kind of like the mixing and application aspect of that. There's a lot more that you can go into, and there's no way that I can cover that in a single video. There's no way that I can cover that probably in a series in its own right, because again, there's just no right or wrong way to do that, but I want you to be mindful of that. The next topic that I want to talk about is just practice with understanding what role a bass line is supposed to play. Whenever you're writing bass music, the most important parts, well, in my opinion, are the drums and the bass, right? Because that's what everybody's going to be paying attention to in that style of music. And that applies to house, that applies to dubstep, to rhythm, to anything that focuses on the low end. You can do that to other genres as well, but that's just kind of like the realm that I'm talking about. Electronic music specifically that focuses on bass. One thing that you can do to practice, like let's say your bass lines aren't that great, is instead of like trying to create the coolest sounds that you possibly can and trying to make that stuff usable, take a step back and go into a little bit more of an abstract approach and focus more so on rhythmic placement. So if we listen to this right here and we kind of go along with this, boom, 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 wah, boom, 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 boom. So even though I might not have the sounds or something, like I can still place these things right here and practice imagining what possibilities or what kind of sounds I might want to place within that, even if I can't make that. And what it's going to do is help you practice cultivating an imagination over that. And you can use that to your advantage to try to, again, once you have a little bit of experience, maybe apply some of the weird stuff that we've made and see if it fits for you. Or maybe it doesn't have to even be a bass. It can be something else that might seemingly fit. So if you've got like a pad or something, maybe that can go and you can write with that placement. But it's kind of like this in between of writing in silence, right? Because it's not in complete silence. You've got this reference of a drum track that's already going on. It's just basically playing with what kind of possibilities that you can think about as far as implementing a rhythm that I guess in theory would be a bass. This is a really powerful tool, and I hope that that made sense, because honestly, this is, yeah, please don't overlook that. If that didn't make sense, please go and watch the video again, because this is something that you really can use to cultivate, especially if you're a beginner. So with those two little things out of the way, let's go ahead and actually talk about some of the applications that I have. Now, one thing that you can do is bounce out a long note, kind of like this. Let's go ahead and turn this on. Okay, now the way that I actually ended up getting this was from taking that same patch that we had and bouncing out one long note and turning all the macros and stuff just kind of over time in that way. And what we end up with is a sound design jam. Some people call it mud pies. I don't really care what you call it. It's just a chunk of audio, and we can start to use some of these things as fills. Now, this is the safest way to apply this stuff, and the reason why is because it doesn't have to be a bass. It's just an effect. So let's say you've got this whole drum thing and you don't got nothing else going on. Well, you can still place these cool little sounds as a turnaround or as a fill towards the end of your bars. And suddenly, you start to have just a little bit more material to work with. These basses, or fill basses, so to speak, aren't really pitched or aren't really like even scaled to a specific tonality. They're all just kind of random sounds, but they work because, for one, the rest of my drum kit is heavily distorted along with all the other sounds that I would apply to it. But two, it's just an abstract sound that kind of sounds cool. Now, the thing is that you can apply this into a lot of different things. It can be used as maybe like cool texture sounds on an intro. So like if you've got something right here at the beginning and you use like a really long note that goes into delay, then it doesn't necessarily have to be a fill bass. It's really just creative effects that you can pretty much place in anywhere that you seem might fit. The hardest place to fit these is over drums or during the middle of something that is supposed to be the main focus of the tune. And that's something that I really want to warn you guys about. Not to say that you can't do it, but a lot of times the biggest mistake that people do is they'll take this long audio cut like this, and then they'll just take one sound and then start to come on over here and layer this stuff, and then just like put way too many sounds and way too many, I guess, rhythm hits as a whole. At least that was something that I did for years, and that was a huge mistake that I probably will still make today. But these days I'm a little bit more mindful, and I realize that I don't have to have so many bass hits in here, and you'll figure out when we get to there, when we get a little bit further. But just keep that in mind. You don't have to have so many hits, and sometimes like establishing a consistent rhythm with this stuff, or only playing these particular basses maybe just like a little bit throughout the rhythm, can actually be incredibly helpful to you. So let's go ahead and move on to the main bass now. Now, the cool thing about this whole project that we did is that if we have the neuro turned off and the generator turned off, we have a consistent kind of solid sub sound. Now for this in particular, one thing that you can do is you can come on over here and take out some of those low mids to kind of clean everything up. I do have a little bit of chorus over here just to make sure that the top end is a little bit wider. Sorry, that's the same thing right there. And if I take this off and I take this off, the whole sound would just be like this. So you can tell that it does sound really cool, but if we were to kind of play that without cutting those mids right here, this is kind of what that would sound like. Let me make sure that everything else is turned off. Okay. Which is cool, but if we kind of turn this stuff back on, listen to the difference. See, so it becomes a little bit more consistent in that way. But there's another trick that I want to show you within this main bass. If you come over here, one thing that I've learned about phase plant that can actually be really beneficial is that you can duplicate LFOs and create a bunch of different shapes in order to find something interesting. So if we go over here and I turn on one LFO at a time, then what we can practice with, or what we can do, is working on different kind of pitch bends and stuff that might be a little bit more interesting. So for example, this was the first one that we have with this little kind of boom. Let's say I don't like that one. Okay, well, we'll come over here and maybe you want that to be a fill, and you can just use something like that. Okay, well, let's try something different. We can go over here where we've got this going on, and we can map the macros here with a single pitch, or sorry, with a single LFO, and let's listen to how that sounds. So why would this be advantageous? The simple answer is because you're creating rhythm that you can place in here that's going to be consistent without necessarily knowing what you're going to get. Now, how can this be useful? Well, here is another strategy that you can use in order to try to implement something that may or may not be interesting to you. What you can do is you can come on over here and you can either do this with pitch bending, or you can do this with the LFO strategy that I told you. But for now, let's go ahead and do that with automation in case if you don't want to use randomizers and LFOs and stuff. But what you can do with this is make sure that MPE is enabled. And if you're in a regular DAW, you can just do regular pitch bend stuff. But what I'll do is double click into this, and we're going to pull this up, and we're just going to make this like maybe a quarter bar long. We'll set that to loop. And then what I'm going to do is come into here and find a cool little pitch bend. So we'll start from 0, undo, undo. We'll go down, kind of like that, and then we'll go up, kind of like this. And then we'll go back down, kind of like that. Okay, so it's a little bit too fast on that, so now what we can do is pull this back up a little bit, and this can kind of be like a cool downbeat thing or whatever. And now that we have the main pitch movement of this, we can start to play with different iterations of this. And so what we can do is kind of the same thing that I was talking about from before. You can go over here, grab yourself a resampling channel. So we'll go to, I think it's in bass or boosh, then go to main, and then go to main post. And now we'll just set this to record here, and we can practice with these different macros right here. Now, one thing that I will say that will be a little bit easier to keep track of this is to give yourself another quarter bar of space, so that way you'll know when this resets. And I'll show you what I mean here in a second, but check this out. Okay. Cool. So now whenever we grab this here and we open this back up, you'll see that you've got every other quarter bar, all the different hits that you've recorded. Now, even if you don't like any of those sounds, it doesn't matter, because that's not really the point. It's more so about setting a specific piece of movement that is going to be consistent. And then what you can do is when you have that consistency and you loop it, you can start to add variables to it. The variables for us would be the neuro and the generator macros. I accidentally pulled macro 3 up, but that wasn't really necessary. But you can keep doing that until you find something cool and you know that's going to work. Now, the cool thing about this is, in theory, let's say you like this hit, right? And you wanted this to be your downbeat bass. But then, as opposed to going and synthesizing another variation of coming back in here and then trying to make something different from a completely different patch, you can just come on over here, paste it on the next bar or next 4 bars, and then just find a different hit, because it's still the same movement. So you've got this one, which might not work, but it doesn't matter, because, right? And then you've got this one. Okay, that one was just a little bit off. Maybe you'll try this one instead. And what I'm doing is just scrubbing through the audio here between all of those. Okay, maybe this one. And again, this is all conceptual, so it doesn't really matter. That's the same one that we had from before, or on the right. But it's still the same type of sound family. right? And so that's one way that you can implement that strategy into like using this in a consistent manner. Again, with this, that same strategy that I just gave you is really important for this too, because this is how you do exactly what I just said in MIDI, or by not having to go and change the patch. If you go through the trouble of setting up a bunch of stuff and you kind of give yourself the prep work of having a couple of key macros and stuff, then you can just take turns turning on and off an LFO that can give you the movement that you want. And on here, it might actually be a little bit easier because you've got a grid where you have a free multi-stage envelope in order to create that. And I know that especially within something like Bitwig, it's kind of cumbersome, because if you were to do that in automation, you can make a multi-stage envelope, but it's not the best, or it's not the most, I guess, efficient. And there's no multi-stage envelope modulator that's built into Bitwig by nature, except for stage 4, but we all know that's not very good. That's how you do that one. If for whatever reason you are doing this stuff and you don't want to do any of that, just as another variation, or maybe let's just say you want a little bit of randomization, then what you can do is the same thing with this particular sound. You can leave the same automation on here, but the cool thing about this is that if you just leave it on here, it's going to be different every time. This is the same note, same patch, but because of the generator and because of the randomizers and because of the neuro processing that we did to that patch, you're always going to have variation. And so if you just want to leave it in random in that way, then you can do that. If you want to bounce this part out, then you can do the same thing that I just explained here. Sometimes you want that. Maybe let's just say like you don't have an idea for a fill or something and you just want to leave it up to chance and see what happens and then bounce it out and see if you like it. You can do that. Worst case scenario, like this is kind of like backwards, but you can always bounce out the master of what you have with that specific like part that you like and then just like splice it in and make sure that, I guess, you turn the reverb off or whatever when you bounce that. But again, sometimes people just want randomness within their tunes, and there's no, again, right or wrong, but that's just one way that you can kind of try to achieve that in that sense. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is kind of what I was describing from before, and that goes into bouncing out a long audio cut, kind of like this. So we'll turn that on. Let me make sure this other stuff is turned off, and you get something kind of like this. Okay, I think you get the point, right? Well, what you can do is you can come on over here and you can maybe just find one little piece that you like. That just sounded like a cool little like metallic piece of percussion or something that we're using. And then what I've gone and done and thought about was just making a simple call and response, which sounds like this. So I've got call, response, call, response, call, response, call, response with the fill. And again, that's kind of where it comes into you not having to need to be excessive with how many cuts you have, if that makes sense. You're just trying to find something that can be used or repeatable as a main idea. So in context, it sounds like this. And there's nothing wrong with doing this, and I would actually argue that most people that have a tutorial on MudPies or sound design jams or something like this would argue that this is kind of like the way to go, and that's pretty much the way that they did it. And again, like if you like kind of sifting through audios or something, then you can always do that. Now, one cool thing that you can think about, because we have one long audio chunk, and like the advantage to this is that it's actually really easy to find something new, even though it might not be easy to find like the right thing. But in Bitwig's case, if you're on a Mac, you can hold Option and Command right here, and this will scrub through the sample, kind of like what I was talking about up here. But let's say like we like this part. Maybe on this part, I want to do something different. So what I can do, I've already got a copy of that, which is always a good rule of thumb, is make a copy of like the part that you like in case if you can't find something else. But now I can just kind of sift through this and see if there's anything else that's interesting. It doesn't really matter, but that's actually kind of cool too, right? So maybe you want to do like call A call B, something like, and then you want to do like a call C or something. All of those are definitely viable. And again, like let's say you find a bunch of different things and you don't want to give up any of those. Well, again, just create a copy of it. And worst case scenario, what you can do is when you're stuck in the 8-bar loop, not a matter of if, but a matter of when, let's say you roll with this idea, right? Well, what you can do instead is keep this, right? And then when you're ready to transition into the B section, then all you have to do is something as simple as duplicating this and instead replacing that part with something like this. Oh, undo. And then maybe on this section, right, there's more sample to this, so you can actually just see what it sounds like if there's a fill right here. That's actually pretty cool. So you've got the first section, which is and then maybe you just want to kind of mix it up, so you can do something like, right? And suddenly you've got double the content and you didn't really have to do a whole lot of work into that. You've kind of already set yourself apart for the next, I guess, section or something, or you can implement the same strategy for writing in this way. And what I just did, you can do with any of the other stuff too. But I mean, again, there's just a ton of options that we can do whenever you're talking about writing bass lines. So the next one that we have is kind of like a two-part thing. The first thing that I want to talk about is taking that same idea that we had right here, which we've already played that sample. If you stretch that out and double, so something, I'm going to duplicate this actually, and let's move it over here. So let's say you stretch this out. You can do it as many times as you want, kind of like this, and you listen to that. It's going to sound something like this. Just stupid broken, right? So what you can do is you can drag that into a sampler over here. And what I've gone and done is if you take a look at this, I've got a randomizer in texture mode on the playhead and then also on the grain size. And then I've kind of just created one long note. So we'll listen to that. It's going to take a second to move, but it will eventually. Come on. There we go. I don't know why it does that, but you can start to see that by having that move on its own, it's going to do something crazy. I really don't know why it takes so long for that to activate. It's almost like it took like 8 bars or so, even though this is set at 2.19 bars. But yeah, once you have that set, you can kind of just let that go. And what I used to do was I'd hit J where I'd bounce this out, but you actually don't have to do that. What you can do instead is right click and then go to just slice to multi-sample where you've got something right here, or you can do the same thing to where you just hit J and then you can bounce to audio in that way and kind of like find the same cuts, right? So it's an extra step. So the extra step that I'm talking about would be the same idea as what we just did right here, just with more granular stuff. And like the amount of resampling that you can do is really limitless. And you can even kind of stretch everything out to hell and use it to create like a percussive kit, so to speak. However, if you do right click and you go into slice to multi-sample, then what this will do for you is it'll, depending on what you tell it to do, it can slice everything up to 128. So all of these are half bar samples. So it's all the same thing. It's going to be different because this is randomized, but if you take a listen to this, then you can obviously tell that it's pretty much like got the same characteristics, but all of these are in half bar chops. So what you can do is instead of doing it in audio, you can come over here and just find something in MIDI that you like. This is pretty much how I write all of my IDM tunes, but sometimes you can find some interesting stuff by doing bass or granulated bass in here in MIDI as well. So this is what this sounds like on its own. So one thing to consider is that anytime you bounce something into a sampler, it automatically gain stages it for you. So this is at technically 0, but it always turns it down by like 6 dB. So you might have to come back into here and pump this up a little bit more because by default it sounds like this. And if you were to play that with the drums, I gotta turn that one off, sorry. Then obviously it's way more quiet. So you might have to bring that back with either some saturation or limiting or clipping or whatever your choice is for that kind of thing. But once everything is kind of leveled out and kind of a consistent volume, then you get something kind of like this. Okay, well maybe let's say that you want to get, I guess, really creative and stuff. Well, from all these different strategies that I showed you, you can start to combine these in such a way that might be really interesting. So let's say right here, I'm going to take this one out. And what I can do instead is turn this one on, and then I can go. Okay, maybe there can be a moment right there. So instead we'll just move that one there and turn that one on. All right, I changed my mind. I don't like that one. Let's go back to this one, which, you know, is kind of a little bit more simple. So we'll move that back over toward that space, and then we'll play between just having a main subline. And you can do a melody with this or whatever, but it will sound something like... And let's say you duplicate all this stuff and maybe one thing sounds cool or whatever. Well, now you've given yourself a bunch of content to work with, and you can kind of just mix and match as you please to create something even more complex. And maybe one of these, I guess, skills or one of these practices or strategies can work all on its own. It just depends on what you like to do. But this kind of covers maybe not every aspect, but all the aspects that I know anyways, or that I can think of how to take an abstract sound kind of like this that we did from before. And at least in the context of bass, transforming that into something that is a little bit more, I guess, usable or tangible in that way. The key components of that is just making sure that the low end is in mono if you're going to keep this as like a bass that has low end in it. And the flip side of that is that if you're using this as a mid bass, well, then you can just cut the lows out and replace it with the sub, which is totally fine too, which I never do, but that is a thing. Or worst case scenario, you can use this as your subline, just give it a low pass filter or whatever, and then you can put all the weird stuff on top of it. I like to keep the original character of it, but whatever. The other thing that we didn't talk about, or that we briefly touched on, is that these sounds don't have to be a bass or a fill. They can be turned into a pad. You can take one little piece of this audio and stretch it out into a sampler, drench it in reverb, and suddenly you've got this crazy, slow, evolving movement thing, right? So the potential behind making sounds like this, at least in the form of experimental sound design, has proven like so valuable to me. And that's kind of why I was so proud to release the Eternum pack, because I see so much, I guess, ideas and so much potential that I haven't even realized with my own music yet, within this kind of approach to sound design. And it's not to say that one day everybody's going to be sounding the same in that way, but if you look at the advantages of doing this, for one, it'll teach you how effects interact with each other. Two, it'll get you closer to making the cool monster sounding basses, of course, which is the given. Three, it challenges you to hear sound in a perspective that you probably haven't thought of before. There's probably more benefits to that, but those are some key points about why you might want to do something like this. I guess, yeah, 4 would be like just in the amount of versatility that you get out of a single patch. And there's a lot of different ways to make generators. There's a lot of different ways to kind of do this in general. I just found that phase plant is the easiest to do. And if you have another strategy about how you like doing this stuff, or maybe like you're already halfway there and you know how to make the Neurobass aspect of it, you can still apply these strategies as I've said before. So to kind of round things out, you can do this by bouncing it into audio. You can do it by bouncing into MIDI. Just make sure that you have a general practice about keeping everything kind of consistent and level as far as bass design goes. Like heavy compression can also help that as well. Make sure that your low end is in mono, and then kind of just try to focus on creating a cool, catchy rhythm that usually involves some kind of call and response. Aside from that, I mean, who am I to tell you how to use this stuff? So that's pretty much it for the comprehensive guide to Neurobass Season 3. I don't really have much else to teach you guys, at least as of now. Hopefully within the next year or something, I'll come up with a bunch of cool other strategies or whatever, but I literally tried to throw everything in the kitchen sink at you to get you up to date on what you need to know for making cool bass, for making it a cool generator, for getting the most versatility out of it, and applying production strategies to it. So thank you guys so much if you stuck with me. If you haven't watched the other videos yet, I would highly appreciate it. And if you can, please interact with my content. Give me some comments. Let's have a discussion on things that you might like to do. And yeah, let's get it going. If you guys want to buy that pack, it's on www.alckemy.com. It's called Eternum, and I hope that you love it as much as I do. This has been a blast to make, but I am done with the comprehensive guide to Neurobass.